Welcome to the late night session. Tonight, we are going through 12 stories of the things the world tries to hide, but the earth eventually gives back. It is raining outside right now, a steady, rhythmic drumming against the window that makes the rest of the world feel very far away. If these stories help you settle in or find some quiet at the end of your day, please consider subscribing or leaving a comment to let me know where you are listening from tonight. Before we begin, do me a small favor and gently tap that like button. Just a quick check to make sure it is still responsive. The same way you might double-check the deadbolt on your front door before you finally turn off the lights for the evening. Stay careful out there. Now, let us look at what happened on a cold morning in Poland, when a river decided it had carried a secret for long enough. In January of 1999, a tugboat named the Elk was fighting its way through the industrial stretches of the Vistula River in Kraków. The water was a heavy, churning gray, filled with the silt and runoff of a Polish winter. The captain felt a sudden, rhythmic vibration shuddering through the deck plates, a mechanical stutter that told him something was caught in the propeller. He assumed it was a discarded piece of trash or perhaps an old leather trench coat. When the crew finally managed to haul the obstruction out of the freezing water and onto the metal deck, they did not find a coat. They found a pale, rubbery object that looked like a heavy vest. But as the captain leaned closer, he saw a patch of dark hair and the distinct shape of a human ear. It was the skin of a young woman, meticulously removed from her body in a single, surgical piece, designed by someone who intended to wear it like a garment. To understand how something so impossible could end up in the dark silt of the Vistula, we have to pull back and look at the life of 23-year-old Katarzyna Zawada. Katarzyna was a student of religious studies at the Jagiellonian University, a woman who seemed to exist in the soft, quiet spaces between the loud edges of the city. She lived in a small, tidy apartment with her mother, Bogusława, where the air usually smelled of steeped tea and the old, vanilla scent of library books. Katarzyna was not a person who sought out the spotlight. In fact, she seemed to actively shrink away from it. She was intelligent, deeply thoughtful, and possessed a focused, internal world that few people were ever invited to see. Her days followed a very specific, predictable rhythm that centered around the university and the vast, silent halls of the library, where she felt most at home among the rows of ancient texts and the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. She had a habit of wearing long, dark overcoats that seemed a size too large, almost as if she were trying to disappear inside the fabric. When she walked through the streets of Kraków, she kept her eyes down, her footsteps light and hurried, moving with the purpose of someone who wanted to reach her destination without being noticed. She was a ghost in her own life, a girl who preferred the company of long-dead philosophers to the chaotic energy of her peers. Her mother watched her with a mixture of pride and a quiet, nagging worry that only a parent can truly understand. Bogusława knew that her daughter was fragile in a way the modern world did not respect, a soul built for a slower, more contemplative century. They shared a bond that was rooted in silence and small gestures, a hand placed on a shoulder, a favorite meal prepared without being asked, the shared comfort of a home where nothing ever seemed to change. In the autumn of 1998, Katarzyna began to drift even further into the periphery. She had stopped attending many of her lectures, and her mother noticed a new, heavy shadow behind her eyes. Katarzyna had always struggled with a deep, private sadness, a depression that made the simple act of existing feel like an exhausting climb. But this was different. She seemed distracted, her thoughts pulled towards something or someone that she could not name. Despite the internal pressure she was under, she maintained the small rituals that kept her grounded. She still visited her favorite bookstore near the main square, and she still made sure to be home in time for dinner every night. On November 12th, 1998, Katarzyna stood in the hallway of their apartment and pulled on her dark coat. She told her mother she was heading to a doctor's appointment and would be back before dark. Bogusława watched the door click shut, the sound echoing in the small hallway. It was a completely ordinary moment, one that had happened 1,000 times before. There was no sense of impending dread, No sudden chill in the air. Just the mundane reality of a Tuesday afternoon in Krakow. But as the hours passed and the sun began to sink behind the industrial skyline, the silence in the apartment started to feel heavy and wrong. By 9 o'clock that night, the silence had turned into a physical pressure. Katarzyna was never late, and she never left her mother wondering where she was. Bogusława called the doctor's office, only to find that Katarzyna had never checked in for her appointment. She called her daughter's few friends, her voice rising in pitch with every unanswered question. No one had seen her. No one knew where the girl in the dark coat had gone. The search began with a frantic, disorganized energy. The police were initially dismissive, suggesting that a 23-year-old woman might have simply decided to take a break from her life, perhaps traveling to another city to clear her head. But Bogusława knew that was impossible. Katarzyna did not have the temperament for a spontaneous escape. She was a creature of habit, a girl who needed the safety of her mother's roof to survive the night. Weeks turned into months, and the city of Kraków began to forget the name of the quiet student who had vanished into the November fog. The investigation went cold, the files sitting on a desk in a cramped precinct, while the winter snow covered the tracks she might have left behind. Bogusława remained in the apartment, keeping the lights on and the tea ready, living in the agonizing suspension of a mother who cannot mourn because she does not yet have a body. Then came the morning on the Elk, when the forensic teams arrived at the riverbank to take possession of the vest found in the propeller. They were met with a sight that challenged their understanding of human depravity. The skin had not been torn or hacked away. It had been removed with a level of anatomical precision that suggested the killer had significant medical or taxidermy training. It was almost a complete shell of a human being. The recovery of the skin sent a shockwave through the Polish legal system. The authorities realized they were not dealing with a typical crime of passion or a random act of violence. They were dealing with a specialized, fetishistic predator who had spent hours, perhaps days, over Katarzyna's body. The FBI was consulted, and profilers began to piece together the mind of a man who viewed a human being not as a person, but as a material to be harvested and shaped. For nearly 2 decades, the case of the Vistula flare sat like a dark stain on the history of the city. The investigation spanned continents, with detectives looking into similar crimes in other countries, but nothing matched the specific, haunting nature of what had happened to Katarzyna. The killer had gone back to his life, moving through the same streets as Bogusława, perhaps even standing behind her in a grocery line, hiding his true face behind a mask of normalcy. The breakthrough did not come until 2017. Through the use of advanced forensic biology and 3-dimensional terrain mapping, investigators began to look closely at a man named Robert J., a quiet, eccentric individual who lived in a nearby apartment. Robert had a history of animal cruelty and had been trained in martial arts. But more importantly, he had a documented obsession with human anatomy and the transformative power of skin. The police discovered that Robert had worked in a medical laboratory and had access to the tools required for such a precise flaying. He was a man who felt like an outsider, a person who struggled with his own identity and had a deep-seated desire to become something else. When they finally moved in to arrest him, they found a man who had been living in the shadow of his own crime for 19 years, never moving away, never changing his routine. In the final reconstruction of the crime, the prosecution described a nightmare that took place in a private, soundproofed space. Robert had lured Katarzyna away, perhaps by exploiting her kindness or her interest in religious history. He had kept her alive for some time, subjecting her to a series of physical ordeals designed to break her spirit before he began the process of removing her skin. He had done it while she was still breathing, ensuring the skin remained supple. The physical setting of that final room was cold and sterile, smelling of copper and cheap industrial cleaners. The pressure in the air was thick, the silence broken only by the rhythmic, wet sound of a scalpel moving through tissue. Katarzyna lay there, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her internal world finally collapsing into a single, agonizing point of reality. Her final thought was not of escape, but of her mother, sitting in the apartment with the lights on, waiting for a girl who would never come home. Robert J. was eventually sentenced to life in prison, but the resolution of the legal case did not erase the image of what was found in the river. The skin of Katarzyna Zawada remains a symbol of a horror that is almost too quiet to comprehend. It is the reminder that beneath the surface of a beautiful city, there are currents that move in ways we cannot see, carrying things that were never meant to be found by the light of day. On the other side of the world, in a place where the water is warm and the sky is a deep, bruised purple, another kind of silence was about to be broken. Sometimes, the threat does not come from a single man in a dark room, but from the very machines we trust to keep us safe. As the Princess of the Orient moved into the Isla Verde passage, the passengers had no idea that the floor beneath their feet was about to become a wall. It was nearly midnight on September 18, 1998, as the Princess of the Orient churned through the Isla Verde passage. The massive ferry, a 14,000-ton titan of the seas, leaned into the wind while the captain, Hidazan, gripped the bridge railing. The ship was a floating palace of steel and velvet, its lights burning like a string of jewels against the suffocating blackness of the Philippine night. Below the bridge, the interior of the vessel was a world of its own, insulated from the rising roar of Typhoon Vicky. The air inside the grand lobby smelled of expensive floor wax, heavy bunker fuel, and the faint, sweet scent of tropical fruit. Passengers moved through the hallways with the easy confidence of people who believed that a ship this size was immune to the whims of the ocean. In the second-class cabins, families were settling in for the long journey from Manila to Cebu. The rhythm of the ship was a comforting vibration that could be felt in the soles of the feet and the small of the back. It was a steady, mechanical heartbeat that spoke of power and stability. People unpacked their bags, laid out small snacks on narrow tables, and adjusted the pillows on their bunks. In the first-class dining room, the crystal chandeliers swayed only slightly, their delicate tinkling drowned out by the muffled thrum of the engines. The staff moved with practiced grace, clearing plates and pouring tea, their white uniforms crisp under the warm glow of the lights. To those inside, the storm outside was merely a background noise, a distant drumming against the thick glass of the portholes. Among the hundreds of passengers was a young father who sat on the edge of his bed, watching his daughter sleep. He listened to the sound of her rhythmic breathing, a soft counterpoint to the deep, low-frequency hum of the vessel. The room was small but tidy, a private sanctuary in the middle of the sea. He felt the weight of his own exhaustion, but also a quiet sense of satisfaction that they were finally on their way. He watched the way the shadows danced on the wall as the ship rose and fell. It was a gentle motion, a slow tilting that felt like a cradle being rocked. He traced the grain of the wooden cabinet with his thumb, noting the fine layer of dust that had gathered in the corners. These were the small, mundane details of a life in transit, the objects that anchored a person to reality when the world outside was nothing but water. Down in the cargo hold, the atmosphere was different. Here, the smell of grease and salt was overwhelming. Dozens of trucks and shipping crates were lashed to the deck with heavy chains, their metal frames groaning as the ship met the first real swells of the typhoon. The air was thick and humid, vibrating with the sheer force of the engines, working to push the Princess of the Orient through the Isla Verde passage. The crew members moved through the narrow catwalks with flashlights, checking the tension of the lines. They spoke in low tones, their voices barely audible over the mechanical cacophony. They knew the passage was a bottleneck where the currents and storm surges could become unpredictable. They felt the pressure of the ocean pressing against the hull, a physical force that seemed to make the very air in the hold feel dense. Back in the passenger areas, the sense of luxury remained intact. The grand staircases, draped in rich red carpeting, led upward toward the observation decks. The wood paneling on the walls was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the golden light of the sconces. It was an environment designed to project safety and wealth, a steel fortress that promised to keep the chaos of the natural world at bay. The passengers continued their nightly routines, unaware that the captain was watching the barometer drop with alarming speed. In the cabins, people were drifting off to sleep, their bodies adjusting to the tilt and sway of the deck. They didn't see the way the whitecaps were beginning to climb the sides of the ship, or the way the rain was turning into a solid horizontal sheet that obscured everything beyond the glass. For many, this trip was a rare treat, a chance to experience the Titanic of the Philippines in all its glory. They took pride in the ship's reputation, believing the marketing that claimed it was the most advanced ferry in the region. They didn't think about the center of gravity or the weight of the cargo in the hold. They only thought about the destination and the families waiting for them on the docks in Cebu. The young father eventually lay down beside his daughter, pulling a thin blanket over his shoulders. He could hear the faint sound of music drifting from a distant lounge, a tinny, cheerful melody that seemed out of place in the middle of a typhoon. He closed his eyes, letting the vibration of the ship pull him towards sleep. He didn't know that the floor beneath him was about to become a wall. The first off detail was subtle. It was not a loud crash or a sudden jolt, but a change in the way the ship recovered from a roll. Usually, the Princess of the Orient would tilt to one side and then slowly, majestically right itself. But at 12:15 in the morning, the ship leaned to the starboard side and stayed there. It was a list of only 5 degrees, but it felt permanent, as if the world had shifted. In the dining room, a stack of saucers slid 3 inches across a table, making a sharp, porcelain screech that cut through the conversation. The waiters paused, their hands hovering over the tables, waiting for the ship to level out. It didn't. The chandeliers remained tilted at an odd angle, their crystals no longer tinkling but hanging silent and tense. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. The pressure began to rise in the cargo hold. A single chain, stressed beyond its limit by a massive wave, snapped with a sound like a gunshot. A 10-ton truck shifted 6 inches, its tires screaming against the metal deck. The list increased to 7 degrees, then 10. In the cabins, passengers woke up not to a sound, but to the sensation of their bodies being pressed against the edges of their bunks. The young father opened his eyes and realized he was leaning into the wall. He stood up, but his balance was wrong. The floor was no longer a flat surface, but a gentle slope leading toward the sea. He heard a low, rhythmic booming coming from deep within the ship, the sound of unsecured cargo slamming into the hull plates. It was a heavy, industrial sound that felt like it was vibrating inside his own chest. By 12:30, the list had reached 15 degrees. The luxury of the ship was disintegrating. The grand red carpets were now slick surfaces that people were sliding across. In the hallways, the sound of laughter had been replaced by a low why, frantic murmur of confusion. People were standing in their doorways, clutching the frames, looking at each other with eyes that were wide and wet with sudden terror. The situation reached the point where it could not return to normal when the captain failed to order an immediate evacuation. He believed the pumps could handle the water entering the hold, but the cargo continued to shift with every wave. The Princess of the Orient was no longer a ship, it was a dying animal, leaning further and further into the black water as the wind of Typhoon Vicky reached its peak. The interior architecture of the ferry now became a series of lethal traps. The wide, beautiful staircases were no longer paths to safety, but vertical chutes. Because the ship was tilting so far to one side, the doors to many cabins were now positioned above the heads of the people inside. They were trapped in their luxury boxes, listening to the roar of the ocean, getting closer and the lights beginning to flicker. You are standing at the end of a long, carpeted hallway on the upper deck. The world has tilted 45 degrees, turning the floor into a steep, polished slide that ends in a wall of rising black water. The air is thick with the smell of spilled engine oil and the ozone of short-circuiting wires. You can hear the rhythmic, metallic boom of the hull buckling under the pressure of the sea. The situational pressure is a physical weight, pressing against your lungs as you realize the exit is 10 feet above you. A glowing rectangle of moonlight that you cannot reach. Your fingers are raw from clawing at the smooth wood paneling, trying to find a grip that isn't there. You look down and see the dark water swirling around your knees, cold and smelling of salt. The thought hits you, the door is the ceiling now. The lights died all at once, plunging the ship into a total, suffocating darkness. The only sound was the screaming of the wind and the terrifying, grinding noise of steel tearing against steel. When the Princess of the Orient finally went down, it happened with a speed that defied logic. The massive vessel simply turned over and slid into the abyss, taking hundreds of people down into the pressure of the Isla Verde passage. Those who managed to escape found themselves in a nightmare of a different kind. They were floating in 15-meter waves, their skin coated in thick, black bunker fuel that burned their eyes and filled their mouths. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning that revealed the chaos of the debris field. There were no lifeboats, only people clinging to pieces of wood and each other. For 12 hours, the survivors fought to stay afloat. They formed human chains, linking arms in the oil-slicked water to prevent the current from pulling them apart. They could feel the rhythmic pulse of the ocean against their bodies, a force so powerful it felt like it was trying to crush their ribs. In the silence between the waves, they could hear the splashing of predators moving through the water nearby. The investigation later revealed that the sinking was a tragedy of ego and physics. The ship had been top-heavy, and the shift in cargo created a momentum that no pump could counter. The captain had stayed on the bridge until the end. Or perhaps he had vanished into the storm, his body was never recovered. The Princess of the Orient became a massive, lightless tomb, sitting 150 meters deep. Today, the wreck remains a haunting destination for elite divers, a steel skeleton covered in silt and ghost nets. It is a reminder of the night the Titanic of the Philippines met a force it couldn't bargain with. The Isla Verde passage has moved on, its currents still moving with the same indifferent power. But the heavy smell of fuel and the sound of shifting steel still echo in the stories of those who survived. Sometimes, the weight of the water is what breaks a person. Other times, it is the weight of the secrets kept on land. In the next case, the danger was not a storm at sea, but a quiet, educated woman who lived in a shed, and the landlords who realized that her silence was worth more than her life. The trees of Ontario hold a very different kind of cold. Winter, 1998, on a narrow dirt path known as Cider Road 15 in Huntsville, Ontario, a 77-year-old woman named Joan Lawrence leaned into the biting wind, her small frame nearly swallowed by a heavy, tattered coat. She was pulling a weathered wooden sled through the knee-deep snow, the runners making a faint, rhythmic creaking sound that was the only music in the frozen woods. To the wealthy vacationers who flocked to the Muskoka region, Joan was simply the cat lady, a strange, peripheral figure who existed on the jagged edges of their manicured world. They saw her walking her cats on leashes through the brush, a sight so bizarre it became a local curiosity. They didn't see the woman who had once been a teacher and a writer, a person of sharp intellect and deep, private history. Joan lived in a 10-by-10 wooden shed on a sprawling gaff, neglected farm owned by the Lawn family. The structure had no running water, no electricity, and no insulation against the brutal Canadian winters. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the warm, musk-heavy smell of dozens of cats. It was a life of extreme, intentional poverty, but for Joan, it was a sanctuary she had chosen. She was a woman of fastidious habits, despite her surroundings. She spent hours reading by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, her mind still sharp and hungry for information. She wrote letters in a graceful, disciplined hand, her words reflecting a level of education that felt out of place in a shack made of scrap lumber. She was a relic of a different era, a person who had simply opted out of a world she no longer recognized. The cats were her primary focus, her reason for enduring the physical hardships of Cider Road 15. She knew each one by name, recognizing their unique personalities and the subtle shifts in their vocalizations. They were her companions, her children, and her protectors. In the silence of the woods, their constant, low-frequency purring provided a layer of comfort that made the lack of human contact bearable. Her relationship with the outside world was transactional and cautious. She would trek into town with her sled to buy bags of cat food and basic supplies. Her movements slow but determined. The local shopkeepers knew her as a woman of few words, someone who settled her bills in cash and never asked for help. She was fiercely independent, a trait that both protected her and made her remarkably easy to overlook. The Lon brothers, who owned the property, were the primary figures in her limited social circle. They were the ones who had offered her the shed when she had nowhere else to go, creating a dynamic of dependency that felt increasingly heavy. To Joan, they were a necessary evil, the gatekeepers of the only home she had left. She paid them her rent from her modest pension, believing she had found a stable arrangement. She would often sit on an old, rusted school bus that sat sinking into the mud near her shed. It was a strange, metal carcass in the middle of the forest, a place where she could sit and watch the light change across the trees. From that vantage point, the world felt manageable. She could hear the wind whistling through the cracked windows of the bus, a hollow, lonely sound that matched the quiet rhythm of her own breathing. Joan had once lived a life of middle-class stability, but a series of personal tragedies and financial setbacks had slowly stripped that away. She didn't mourn the loss of her status or her belongings. She only cared about the autonomy she had managed to preserve. In the shed, she was the master of her own small domain, a philosopher queen in a kingdom of stray cats and cedar trees. She was acutely aware of the passage of time, marking the seasons by the behavior of the birds and the depth of the snow. She had a deep, intuitive understanding of the landscape, knowing which paths would be flooded in the spring and where the berries would grow in the summer. She was a part of the ecosystem, a human element that had successfully integrated into the wild, unforgiving geography of the Canadian Shield. Her education remained her most prized possession, a mental fortress that no one could take from her. She would recite poetry to her cats in the dark, the rhythm of the verses providing a sense of order in the chaotic interior of the shed. She was a woman who lived primarily in her own head, a space where she was still young, still vital, and still connected to the world she had left behind. The local community in Huntsville had a complicated relationship with her. Some felt a sense of pity, while others viewed her with a mixture of suspicion and amusement. She was a story people told dinner guests. A local legend used to add color to the history of the town. Very few people actually stopped to ask if she was okay, assuming that her presence in the woods was simply a choice she was allowed to make. As the winter of 1998 deepened, the physical strain of her lifestyle began to show. Her walk was slower, her frame more fragile beneath the heavy layers of clothing. But her resolve remained unbroken. She continued to pull her sled through the drifts, her eyes focused on the path ahead, her mind already calculating the next day's chores and the needs of the animals she loved. The first off detail was noticed by a neighbor who lived a few miles down the road. It was a gray, overcast afternoon when he saw several of Joan's cats wandering near the edge of the property. They were not being walked on leashes. They were thin. Their fur was matted, and they were crying with a frantic, persistent intensity. It was a sound that didn't belong in the quiet woods of Huntsville. He stopped his truck and watched them for a moment, waiting for the familiar sight of the woman in the heavy coat to appear. But the woods remained silent. The cats continued to circle near the road, their vocalizations getting louder and more desperate. It was as if they were trying to communicate a specific, urgent truth to anyone who would listen. But the neighbor simply shook his head and drove on. A few days later, another resident noticed that the smoke had stopped rising from the chimney of Joan's shed. In the sub-zero temperatures of a Muskoka winter, a lack of wood smoke meant a lack of heat. The silence around the farm began to feel heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the trees. The cats were now seen blocks away from the property, looking for scraps in the trash bins of nearby cottages. The pressure began to rise when the local authorities were finally contacted. When the police arrived at the lawn farm, they found the shed empty. There was no sign of a struggle, but there was also no sign of Joan. Her personal belongings were still there, her books, her letters, her kerosene lamp, but the woman herself had vanished as if she had simply walked into the trees and dissolved into the landscape. The investigation quickly shifted its focus to the Lawn brothers. It was discovered that although Joan had not been seen for weeks, her pension checks were still being cashed. The signatures on the back of the checks were a crude approximation of Joan's graceful hand, a jarring contrast that pointed toward a predatory, calculated intent. The landlords had realized that an invisible woman is a valuable asset. You are standing in the middle of the clearing on Cider Road 15. The air is so cold it feels like glass in your lungs, and the only sound is the rhythmic, mournful meowing of a dozen hungry cats hidden in the brush. The physical setting is a nightmare of gray wood and rusted metal. The sinking school bus looking like a giant, dying insect in the mud. The situational pressure is a cold, hollow knot in your stomach. You look at the heavy padlock on the outside of the shed door, a piece of hardware that Joan could not have placed there herself. You realize that for weeks, the only world she had left was the one inside these four thin walls. As the light fades over the Canadian shield, a single internal thought flickers through your mind with the weight of cold iron. Nobody is coming for me. The police investigation was hampered by the geography of the farm itself. The soil was acidic and the forest was dense, a combination that could hide and dissolve evidence with terrifying efficiency. In a desperate attempt to find any trace of Joan, the authorities eventually burned down the buildings on the property, sifted through the ash and the charcoal for bone fragments, but they found nothing but the remains of animals. The Lawn brothers were never charged with her murder, only with the fraud related to her pension checks. They remained silent, their eyes cold and indifferent as the story of the cat lady became a piece of local folklore. Joan Lawrence was officially a missing person, but in reality, she had been erased by the very people who were supposed to be her protectors. Her life traded for a few $100s a month. The story of Cider Road 15 leaves a quiet, bitter aftertaste that lingers like the smell of wood smoke on a cold jacket. It is a reminder of how easily a human life can be marginalized until it becomes invisible, and how quickly the world can close over the space where a person used to be. Joan Lawrence didn't just disappear. She was allowed to fade away until there was nothing left but the cries of her cats. A single, tattered ribbon from a cat's leash, caught on a branch in the woods. That was all that remained of a woman who had once taught the world how to read. In the next case, the objects left behind were not ribbons, but a line of colorful, child-sized backpacks. They sat partially buried in a pristine white snowfield, waiting for a spring that would never arrive for the children who carried them. Morning, January 23rd, 1998. A mountain trail near the Les Orres ski resort in the French Alps. A group of 25 students from the St. Joachim School in Brittany adjust their snowshoes, the metal buckles clicking sharply in the thin, crystalline air. Their breath blooms in white clouds that vanish almost instantly against a sky so blue it looks artificial. They are coastal children, more used to the gray, churning salt spray of the Atlantic than the silent, frozen pressure of the high mountains. But today the slope looks like nothing more than a giant, sun-drenched playground. The teenagers come from Morbihan, a place of tidal flats and flat horizons where the world is defined by the rhythm of the sea. For months, this trip to the Alps has been the center of their universe, a chance to escape the damp, winter mists of the coast for the legendary white peaks of the south. They carry bright, nylon backpacks filled with ham sandwiches wrapped in foil, chocolate bars, and small notebooks for sketching alpine flowers. To them, the snow is a novelty, a soft and friendly substance that they have only ever seen in picture books or on the television. Among the group is a 14-year-old girl named Mathilde, who has spent the morning helping her younger classmates secure their gear. She is a natural leader, the kind of person who notices when a friend's scarf is loose or when someone is beginning to lag behind. Her own pack is neatly organized, holding a thermos of hot cocoa and a camera she borrowed from her father. She wants to capture the exact moment the sun hits the jagged ridge of the mountain, a sight she plans to describe to her grandmother when she returns to the flat, gray coast of Brittany. Beside her, a boy named Simon is struggling with the straps of his snowshoes, his fingers stiff with the unaccustomed cold. He is the class clown, the one who kept everyone laughing during the long bus ride from the north. But here, in the shadow of the peaks, he has become uncharacteristically quiet. He keeps looking up at the high ridges, where the wind is kicking up fine plumes of snow that look like white smoke. The scale of the landscape is overwhelming to him, a vertical world that seems to demand a level of respect he doesn't yet know how to give. Their teacher, a woman in her late 40s, moves among them with a watchful, motherly energy. She has organized this trip with meticulous care, vetting the hostel, the transport, and the mountain guides to ensure that her students are as safe as they are in their own classrooms. She trusts the experts, believing that the mountain is a predictable environment as long as one follows the rules. She checks the time, noting that they are perfectly on schedule for their nature walk through the larch forest, a path that has been described to her as a gentle and sheltered route. The air smells of pine resin and cold, dry earth. As the group begins to move, the sound of 50 snowshoes crunching into the crusty surface of the snow creates a steady, rhythmic pulse. It is the sound of a school day displaced, a collective movement of youth and energy through a landscape that has been frozen for months. The children talk in low voices, their words softened by the vast, open space around them. They feel the sun on their necks, a deceptive warmth that makes the sub-zero temperatures seem like a minor detail that they can easily ignore. In the hostel that morning, they had eaten a breakfast of thick bread and jam, the dining hall loud with the clatter of cutlery and the excitement of the day ahead. They had teased each other about who would fall over first and who would find the most impressive icicle. These are children who have grown up together in a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business. A tight-knit focal unit that feels more like a large family than a school class. Their shared history is written in the playgrounds and beaches of Morbihan, far from the white slopes. The guide, Robert Giraud, leads the way with a long, confident stride. He is a man of the mountains, someone who has spent his entire life navigating the shifts and moods of the Alps. He has seen the morning's weather report, which indicated a high risk of avalanches on the upper slopes. But he is confident in his knowledge of the local terrain. He believes that the forest trail is a safe haven, a place where the trees will act as a natural barrier against any movement of snow. He views the risk as a technicality, something that applies to the peaks, not the paths. As the students climb higher, the forest begins to thin, revealing glimpses of the valley far below. The village of Les Orres looks like a cluster of toy houses, the smoke from the chimneys rising in straight, thin lines. The perspective is dizzying for the children, a reminder of how far they have traveled from the sea-level world they know. They stop frequently to catch their breath, their lungs burning slightly in the thin air. But the beauty of the scenery keeps them moving forward. They feel like explorers on the edge of a new and magnificent territory. Mathilde takes a photo of her friends as they stand against a backdrop of towering granite walls. The light is perfect, a golden hue that makes the snow sparkle like a field of crushed diamonds. She smiles, thinking of how the photo will look on her wall back home, a permanent record of the time she stood on top of the world. She feels a sense of deep, quiet pride in her classmates, watching as they help each other over the steeper sections of the trail. They are proving to themselves that they are capable of handling the challenges of the high country. The snow beneath their feet is strange and inconsistent. In some places, it is hard and icy, reflecting the sun like a mirror. In others, it is soft and powdery, swallowing their snowshoes with a dry, muffled sound. They don't notice the way the layers are stacked, or the way the wind has spent the night carving hidden shelves into the slopes above them. To the children, snow is just snow, a single, uniform substance that exists for their enjoyment. They don't see the tension held within the white sheets, a geological pressure that is waiting for a single, small trigger. As they reach a wide, open clearing just above the forest line, the guide calls for a short break. The students drop their packs, the nylon fabric sliding easily over the frozen crust. They share pieces of chocolate and take long, cold gulps from their water bottles. The liquid tasting of plastic and minerals. The silence of the mountain is absolute here. A heavy, ringing stillness that seems to press against their ears. For a moment, even the most talkative students fall silent, awed by the sheer, indifferent power of the landscape that surrounds them in every direction. Simon finds a small rock and tosses it toward the valley, watching as it bounces once and then disappears into a drift. He laughs, the sound echoing briefly off the rock face before being swallowed by the vastness. He feels a sudden, inexplicable burst of energy, a desire to run and jump in this endless white space. He looks at Mathilde, who is busy adjusting the settings on her camera, and for a split second, everything feels perfect. The world is bright, the company is good, and the day is theirs to command. There is no hint that the mountain is about to speak. The first off detail is not a sight, but a sound. It is a low, hollow whoomph, a noise that sounds like a giant intake of breath, followed by a sudden, heavy settling of the earth. It is a vibration that starts in the soles of their feet and travels up through their legs. A momentary loss of balance that feels like the ground has just dropped an inch beneath them. The guide stops mid-sentence, his head snapping toward the ridge above. For a fraction of a second, the mountain is perfectly still, as if it is holding its breath before delivering a final, devastating blow. The ridge, roughly 200 meters above the students, begins to change shape. A line appears in the pristine white snow, a jagged crack that spreads with the speed of a lightning bolt across the face of the slope. It is a wind slab, a massive, unstable layer of snow that has been perched precariously on a bed of sugar snow. The crack widens, and then, with a sound like a low-frequency groan, the entire face of the mountain begins to slide. It doesn't look like a flow of liquid. It looks like a solid piece of the world has simply detached itself. The guide screams for everyone to run toward the trees, his voice high and thin against the rising roar. But the children are paralyzed, their snowshoes anchoring them to the very ground that is about to be consumed. They watch in a daze as the white wall gains speed, picking up thousands of tons of ice and debris as it hurtles toward the clearing. The roar becomes a physical force, a sound that they feel in their teeth and their lungs, a deafening cacophony of grinding ice that drowns out the screams of the students and the frantic whistles of the guide. Mathilde has time to see the snow hit the first student at the edge of the group, a boy she has known since kindergarten. He is simply erased, swallowed by a wave of white that looks like a breaking ocean swell. She tries to turn, to move toward the shelter of the larches, but the force of the wind ahead of the avalanche knocks her off her feet. She is tossed into the air, her camera ripped from her hands, her world turning into a chaotic, spinning blur of white and gray. The air is suddenly filled with a fine, choking powder that enters her nose and mouth. The situational pressure is a cold, heavy hand that pins her to the earth. She feels the snow close over her head, a weight so immense it feels like a building has collapsed on top of her. The roar of the slide is replaced by a sudden, terrifying silence that is more absolute than anything she has ever experienced. She is trapped in a space no larger than her own body, her limbs frozen in place by snow that has instantly turned into the consistency of set concrete. The air in her small pocket is rapidly warming with her own frantic breath. You are buried beneath 4 meters of packed ice, pinned in a lightless, frozen tome. The physical setting is a crushing, blue-black void where the only thing you can feel is the agonizing weight of the mountain pressing against your ribs, making every shallow breath an act of desperation. The pressure in your inner ear is a sharp, stabbing pain, and the silence is so heavy it feels like a physical substance filling your throat. You try to move your fingers, but the snow is like stone. The thought hits you, the backpacks are the only thing they will see. On the surface, the clearing has been transformed. Where there was once a vibrant group of children and a sun-drenched trail, there is now a jagged, chaotic field of broken ice and uprooted trees. The silence that follows the avalanche is haunting, broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant, frantic shouting of the survivors. The teacher stands at the edge of the slide, her hands raw and bleeding from digging into the hard crust, her voice cracking as she calls out the names of the missing. 9 of her students, the guide, and another teacher are gone. Rescue teams arrive within 15 minutes. Their helicopters, a rhythmic thudding against the silence of the valley. They move with a frantic, professional speed, driving long metal probes into the debris, looking for the soft resistance of a human body. They find the backpacks first, bright splashes of blue and red emerging from the white waste. They are empty of life, their contents spilled across the snow like a discarded history. The rescuers dig with their hands, their shovels, and their hearts. But the snow has done its work with a cold and surgical efficiency. The investigation that followed the tragedy at Les Orres would reveal a chain of human errors and technical oversights. The guide had underestimated the stability of the wind slab, and the school's administration was questioned for allowing a trip during a high-risk alert. The trial became a national sensation in France, a debate over the responsibility of those who lead the young into the wilderness. But for the families in Morbihan, the legal details were white noise. They were left with the silence of 9 empty bedrooms and the memory of children who had never seen the sea again. The mountain guide, Robert Giraud, survived the slide but would never escape the shadow of that morning. He faced the cameras with a face that looked like it had been carved from the very ice that took his charges. He spoke of the unpredictability of the Alps, of the way the plaque vent can look like solid ground until the moment it breaks. His words were technically correct, but they offered no comfort to the mothers who stood on the gray Atlantic coast, waiting for a bus that would return with 9 empty seats and a collection of cameras. Today, a small memorial stands near the trail at Les Orres, a simple stone marker that lists the names of the children from St. Joachim. It is a place where the sun still hits the ridges with a golden light and the air still smells of pine resin. But the silence there carries a different weight now. It is a reminder that the mountain does not care about plans, or education, or the beauty of a school trip. It only knows the physics of the slope and the inevitable pull of gravity. The snow continues to fall, covering the past in a new and indifferent layer. The colorful backpacks of Morbihan, faded by the sun and the years, are now nothing more than evidence in a file. They represent the moment the world stopped for 9 families, a frozen point in time that the retreating ice can never truly surrender. In the next case, the endings were not written in the snow of the Alps, but by a man in Johannesburg who moved through the public parks with a distinctive swagger. He was a shadow that didn't wait for the weather to change. He created his own storms, one rhythmic footstep at a time. Sunset, 1997. In a public park near the industrial ripples of Johannesburg, a young man named Dumasani sat in his car. The windows cracked just enough to let in the scent of eucalyptus and dry grass. Beside him sat his girlfriend, and they were talking about nothing in particular, just the soft, drifting plans of a Friday evening. The air was cooling as the purple light of the Highveld began to stretch across the lake at Wemmer Pan. They had spent the day navigating the high-voltage energy of the city, where the pulse of change was a physical vibration in the streets. Johannesburg was a place that never stayed the same for more than an hour. A sprawling landscape of gold mines and steel towers. For Dumasani, the park was a necessary silence, a gap in the noise where he could finally hear his own thoughts and the voice of the woman he loved. He worked a steady job in a warehouse, his hands often smelling of heavy cardboard and industrial tape. He liked the physical weight of his life, the way his muscles felt tired in a way that meant he had accomplished something. He kept a small photograph of his mother tucked into the sun visor, a reminder of why he worked so hard to build a life in the city. He believed that if you respected the rules of the city, it would respect you back. He was a man of small, deliberate gestures, always making sure the car was locked and the fuel tank was half full. These were the minor rituals that provided a sense of control in a world that often felt unpredictable and chaotic. He noticed the small things, like the way the light hit the ripples on the lake or the specific rattle in his dashboard that he had been meaning to fix with a piece of folded paper for weeks. Beside him, Thandi was reading a magazine, the pages turning with a soft, rhythmic sound. She was the one who had suggested they stop by the water before heading into the noise of the central business district for dinner. She liked the way the eucalyptus trees smelled after a hot day, a sharp and medicinal scent that seemed to clear the city's dust from her lungs. They were content in the cooling cabin of the white Toyota. The car itself was a point of pride for Dumasani, a clean and reliable machine that represented his independence. He kept a vanilla-scented air freshener hanging from the mirror, its shape a little yellow tree that swayed gently as the car idled. The dashboard was polished, and the seats were covered in a gray fabric that felt familiar and safe. It was their private island in a sea of grass and growing shadows. They watched the last of the rowers leave the water, their boats looking like thin wooden splinters against the darkening surface of the pan. The sound of the oars dipping into the water had been a steady, comforting pulse, but now it was gone. The park was slowly emptying of people, the families and joggers moving back toward the safety of the lit streets. Dumasani and Thandi stayed just a few minutes longer. The atmosphere in Johannesburg in the late 90s was one of fragile hope mixed with a very real, jagged sense of danger. Everyone knew which streets to avoid after dark and which parks were better left to the shadows. But Wemmer Pan had always felt different to them, a recreational hub that belonged to the people. They felt that as long as they were together and in the car, they were shielded from the city's teeth. Dumasani reached over and took Thandi's hand, his thumb tracing the knuckles of her fingers. He was thinking about the future, about a house with a small garden and a fence high enough to keep the world out. He was a man who planned for the long term, who saw every paycheck as a brick in a wall he was building for his family. The quiet of the park seemed to validate those dreams, making them feel attainable and real. They spoke about the music they wanted to hear later and the specific spice of the chicken they would order. These were the small, mundane threads that wove their lives together. The sound of their own voices was a barrier against the silence of the trees outside. They didn't notice that the crickets had stopped their chirping in the immediate vicinity of the car, or that the wind had shifted, bringing the smell of wood smoke. The warehouse where Dumasani worked was located in an industrial park not far from here. He was used to the sight of large, silent buildings and the shadows of machinery. He often felt that the city at night looked like a giant clock that had stopped ticking. He was comfortable in that stillness, finding a certain beauty in the way the streetlights reflected off the oil patches in the road. He was a creature of the urban landscape. He checked his watch, a simple digital piece with a plastic strap. It was 6:45. The sun had finally disappeared, leaving behind a sky the color of a fresh bruise. He knew it was time to leave, to move back into the light of the main roads. He reached for the ignition, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the key. He liked the weight of the keychain, which held the keys to his apartment and his workplace. As he turned the key, the engine coughed once and then settled into its familiar tinny hum. The headlights flickered on, two beams of yellow light cutting through the growing darkness of the parking area. They illuminated the trunks of the eucalyptus trees and a few discarded pieces of trash tumbling in the breeze. Dumasani shifted the car into gear, ready to pull away from the edge of the lake and the silence of the park. He looked in his rearview mirror to check for any other cars or pedestrians. The reflection showed only the dark expanse of the grass and the silhouette of a fence line. He felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of being watched, a prickle at the back of his neck that he tried to dismiss as nerves. He told himself it was just the shadows playing tricks on his eyes, a natural reaction to the transition from light to total darkness. Thandi put her magazine away in the glove box, the latch clicking shut with a final, mechanical sound. She looked out the window at the water, which now looked like a sheet of black glass. She felt the cooling air from the vents on her face and adjusted her seatbelt. Everything was normal. Everything was following the script of a Friday night. They were just two people in a car, about to join the flow of the city. The first off detail was not something they saw, but a movement in the periphery. A man was walking along the fence line, his gait strange and distinctive. He moved with a rhythmic, swaggering bounce, his shoulders swaying in a way that looked almost like a dance. He was carrying a heavy canvas bag that seemed to have a weight that didn't match its size. He wasn't running, he was just walking, moving with an eerie confidence. Dumasani slowed the car, his foot hovering over the brake. He watched the man in the mirror, trying to make out his face. But the features were lost in the deep shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. The man stopped walking and turned his head toward the car. For a moment, they were linked in a silent, static tension. The hum of the Toyota's engine seemed to grow louder in the cabin, a buzzing that Dumasani could feel in his teeth. The man began to move toward them, and as he stepped into the peripheral glow of the headlights, Dumasani saw the flash of metal. It wasn't the sleek line of a handgun or the glint of a knife. It was the heavy, industrial head of a hammer. The man didn't hesitate. His stride didn't break. He simply kept coming, that strange, rhythmic swagger carrying him across the grass with a speed that felt predatory and wrong. Dumasani slammed the car into reverse, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The tires spun on the gravel, kicking up a cloud of dust that obscured his view. He looked at Thandi, whose face was pale and frozen in the yellow light of the dashboard. She was staring at the man, her hands gripping the door handle so hard her knuckles were white. The man was now only 10 feet away, and he was lifting the bag. The pressure in the car was sudden and suffocating. The air felt thick with the smell of burning rubber and the ozone of a panicked mind. Dumasani could hear the rhythmic clink-clink of the hammer hitting the metal fence as the man brushed past it. It was a sound that didn't belong in a park, a construction sound that promised destruction. The man's eyes were invisible, but his intent was written in the tilt of his head. He didn't scream or shout orders. He simply reached the car and swung. The sound of the hammer hitting the side window was not a crash, but a dull, sickening thud that made the entire frame of the Toyota shudder. The glass didn't shatter at first. It spiderwebbed, 1,000 white lines blooming in an instant. Dumasani felt the vibration of the impact through the steering wheel, a shock that traveled all the way up his arms. The situation had reached the point where it could not return to normal. Dumasani knew that if he didn't get the car moving now, they would be trapped in a metal cage. He shifted back into drive and floored the accelerator. The car surged forward, grazing a tree and lurching onto the main path. In the mirror, he saw the man standing in the middle of the dust cloud, the hammer hanging at his side, his posture still relaxed. What made the situation so terrifying for the police in Johannesburg was the lack of a signature. Over the past year, people had been found dead in parks all over the city, but the weapons were never the same. Some were shot, some were stabbed, and others were bludgeoned with rocks or hammers. There was no pattern to the victims' men. Women, couples, and shopkeepers were all being targeted by a phantom who seemed to have no preference. Mitski Pistorius, a legendary psychological profiler, was brought in to look at the mounting stack of case files. She realized that while the weapons were chaotic, the geography was not. She noticed that the killer was operating within a very specific radius, a spatial signature that pointed towards someone who lived and worked in the heart of the city. He wasn't a traveler, he was a resident, someone who knew the shadows of the parks intimately. The investigation began to focus on the area around Wemmer Pan. They looked for a man who matched the description given by the few survivors, a man with a distinctive, swaggering walk, someone who moved with the confidence of a rock star. They called it the Mick Jagger walk. It was a small, physical detail that became the key to unlocking the identity of a killer who had managed to stay invisible by being inconsistent. The killer was Cedric Make, a man who worked as a plumber and had a wife and children, to his neighbors. He was an ordinary man, perhaps a bit quiet, but never someone they suspected of prowling the parks with a bag full of hammers and guns. He used his work as a cover, moving through the city with his tools, which served as both his livelihood and his weapons. He killed because it gave him a sense of absolute power. You are lying in the tall, dry grass of a Johannesburg park, the scent of dust and eucalyptus filling your nose. The physical setting is a dark, vast landscape where every rustle of the wind sounds like a footstep. The situational pressure is a cold, rhythmic pulse in your neck as you hear the clink-clink of a metal tool being dragged along a fence nearby. You are small, hidden, and paralyzed by the realization that there is nowhere to run. Your eyes are fixed on the silhouette of a man moving through the trees, his shoulders swaying in that strange, rhythmic swagger. He isn't searching frantically. He is moving with a calm, patient certainty that makes the air feel like it's closing in around you. You press your chest into the earth, trying to disappear into the soil, while the sound of his boots on the gravel gets louder. The thought hits you, he isn't even running. The police finally caught up with Cedric Mackay in December of 1997. They had used geographic profiling to narrow down his likely home base. And when they moved in, they found the evidence of his double life. There were the weapons, the blood-stained clothing, and the stolen items from his dozens of victims. Mackay didn't resist. He simply looked at the officers with a face that held no emotion, no remorse, and no soul. During his trial in 1998, the full scale of his spree was revealed. He was linked to at least 27 murders and dozens of rapes and robberies. He had turned the public spaces of the city into a private hunting ground, exploiting the chaos of a society in transition to hide his own depravity. The judge described him as a chameleon of death, a man who could change his method but never his desire for control. The reconstruction of his crimes showed a man who was a master of the blitz attack. He would wait in the shadows until his victims were at their most vulnerable, often in cars or sitting on benches, and then he would strike with overwhelming force. He didn't care about the weapon, he only cared about the result. He was a predator who understood that in a city full of noise, a hammer hitting glass is a sound that very few people will notice. Cedric Mackay was eventually sentenced to over 1,300 years in prison, a symbolic number that reflected the sheer volume of his crimes. He remains one of South Africa's most prolific and disturbing serial killers, a reminder that the most dangerous people are often the ones who can walk through a crowd without anyone looking twice. He left behind a city that was forever changed, its parks now viewed with a new, lingering suspicion. The story of the Wemmer Pan killer leaves a heavy, metallic aftertaste, like the smell of blood and old iron. It is a reminder that the world does not always follow a logical pattern, and that danger can hide in the most mundane places. Cedric Mackay didn't just take lives, he took the sense of safety that a simple evening in the park used to provide. He proved that a swagger can be as lethal as a gun. Sometimes, the danger is a man moving through the trees with a hammer. Other times, it is the environment itself, a vertical trap that turns a rainstorm into a fire hose. In the next case, the shadows weren't in a park, but deep underground in a cave system in France. The survivors wouldn't be looking for a face in a mirror, but listening for a roar that meant the earth was about to swallow them whole. July 1998, 700 meters below the Vercors Plateau in southeastern France. Nicola Dollimore stops to check the tension on her line, her gloved hands sliding over the wet, muddy sheath of the rope. The air around her is a constant 36 degrees Fahrenheit, a cold that does not bite so much as it gradually leaches the warmth from her bones. She is deep inside the Gouffre Burger, a cave system known to explorers as the basement of the world. Nicola is not a casual visitor to this darkness. She is an elite caver, someone who moves through the vertical architecture of the earth with a methodical, practiced grace. To her, the Burger is a masterpiece of limestone, a series of massive cathedral-like halls and jagged drops that require total concentration. Every carabiner click and every scrape of her boot against the rock is a familiar note in a song she has been practicing for the better part of her adult life. Beside her, Hamish Knott is adjusting the heavy nylon gear bag slung over his shoulder. They have spent years training together in the damp, tight squeezes of British caves. But the Burger is something different. It is vast, a labyrinth of white stone and black voids that was the first in the world to be explored to a depth of 1,000 meters. There is a specific kind of prestige in being here, a sense of standing in a place that very few human beings will ever see. They move in a rhythm that is almost silent, a steady progression of descents and traverses. The light from their headlamps cuts narrow, vibrating paths through the gloom, reflecting off the damp walls and the ancient formations that hang like frozen curtains from the ceiling. The air tastes of wet minerals and the faint, ozone scent of their batteries. It is a world without color, a landscape of gray and obsidian, where the only reality is the next 10 feet of rope. For Nicola, the physical weight of the gear is a comfort, a reminder of her own agency in a place that is entirely indifferent to her presence. She likes the way the harness bites into her hips and the rhythmic sound of the metal ascenders as they slide along the lines. She understands the language of the stone, the way a certain slickness on a ledge indicates a recent flow of water, or how a sharp edge warns of a rope-cutting hazard ahead. Their relationship is built on a foundation of total, unspoken trust. In a place like the Gufferberger, you do not just watch your own footing, you listen for the breathing of your partner. You monitor the way their light moves, looking for the telltale signs of fatigue or hesitation. Nicola and Hamish have reached a point where they don't need to speak to know when to rest or when to push forward. They are a single unit, moving through the deep clockwork of the mountain. In the world above, it is a warm French summer evening. People are sitting in outdoor cafes on the plateau, drinking wine and watching the sun dip behind the jagged ridges of the Alps. The students at the local mountaineering schools are packing their bags for the next day's climb. But for Nicola and Hamish, the surface world has ceased to exist. Their universe has shrunk to the diameter of a limestone shaft and the strength of a 10-millimeter nylon rope. They stop to eat a quick meal of energy bars and cold water in a section known as the Hall of the 13. The space is so large that their lamps cannot find the ceiling, leaving them sitting in a small pool of light surrounded by an infinite, ringing silence. The scale of the hall is humbling, a reminder that the mountain has been carving these spaces for millions of years, long before the first human ever thought to look beneath the surface. Nicola traces the grain of the rock with her finger, noting the fine layers of sediment that tell the story of ancient oceans. She feels a deep, quiet connection to the history of the earth, a sense of being a witness to a process that moves on a scale far beyond a human lifespan. This is why she caves. It is not for the adrenaline, but for the clarity that comes from being in a place where every action has an immediate and absolute consequence. They discuss the plan for the next few hours, their voices sounding thin and small in the vastness of the hall. They are heading toward the Grand Canyon, a long, winding passage that follows a subterranean riverbed. It is one of the most beautiful sections of the Burger, but also one of the most technical. They check their watches, noting that they are perfectly on schedule. Their movements are calm, their minds focused on the mechanics of the climb. There is a specific smell to the Gouffre Burger that Nicola always associates with success. It is the scent of wet limestone mixed with the faint, metallic aroma of the ladders and bolts left by previous expeditions. It is the smell of discovery. As they prepare to move again, she feels a surge of quiet energy, a readiness to meet whatever the cave has to offer. She checks her backup light one last time, the click of the switch sounding final in the dark. Hamish leads the way into the next shaft, his body a dark silhouette against the white rock. Nicola follows, her movements mirroring his with a precision that comes from hundreds of hours of shared experience. They are deep in the rhythm of the cave now, a state of flow where the equipment feels like an extension of their own bodies. They are 700 meters down, and for the moment, everything is exactly as it should be. The first off detail is not a sound, but a subtle shift in the movement of the air. Usually, The atmosphere at this depth is static, a heavy and unmoving pressure that sits in the lungs. But as Nicola clips into the next traverse, she feels a faint, damp wind blowing down from the shafts above. It is a warm breeze, carrying the scent of wet earth and crushed grass, a smell that belongs on the surface, not in the heart of a limestone mountain. She pauses, her headlamp cutting a narrow arc through the mist. She looks at Hamish, who has also stopped. In a cave, wind means a change in pressure, and a change in pressure usually means a change in weather. But they are nearly a kilometer underground for a breeze to reach this far. The movement of air on the surface must be violent. The silence of the Hall of the 13 is replaced by a low, rhythmic thrumming that seems to come from the rock itself. The thrumming grows into a vibration that Nicola can feel in the soles of her boots and the palms of her hands. It is a deep, subsonic growl that sounds like a distant freight train moving through a tunnel. She watches as a small trickle of water, no thicker than a finger, begins to run down the wall beside her. It is brown and filled with silt, a jarring contrast to the crystal-clear drips that usually characterize the burger. Within minutes, the trickle becomes a stream, and the low growl becomes a roar. The sound is coming from above, a terrifying, percussive noise of water hitting rock at high velocity. The Vercors Plateau is acting like a giant funnel for a localized thunderstorm that has just broken over the mountains. Every crack and every sinkhole on the surface is now a drain, and the Gouffre burger is the primary pipe. The pressure in the cave begins to rise as the air is displaced by the incoming torrent. Nicola and Hamish immediately begin to rig their ropes for an emergency ascent. But the vertical shafts they just descended are now becoming waterfalls. The Grand Canyon, which was a dry riverbed only 20 minutes ago, is rapidly filling with a surging, muddy current that is picking up boulders and discarded gear like they are pieces of straw. The situation has reached the point where it cannot return to normal. The cave is no longer a static environment to be explored. It is a pressurized hydraulic system. The water is rising 6 inches every minute, and the sound of the flood is so loud that Nicola has to scream just to be heard by Hamish, who is only 6 feet away. They are trapped in a narrow chimney, and the only way out is up, directly into the path of the falling water. You are hanging on a thin nylon rope in a vertical shaft that has been transformed into a cold, dark fire hose. The physical setting is a lightless stone throat where millions of gallons of water are crashing down from above, blinding you and stripping the heat from your body in seconds. The water is heavy, a solid weight that tries to pull you off the line with every surging pulse. Your headlamp is a dim, useless flicker in the spray. The situational pressure is a physical blow to the chest, a roar so absolute that it feels like it is vibrating inside your skull. You are trying to slide your ascender up the wet rope, but your fingers are numb, white sticks that no longer obey your brain. You look up, and for a split second, the light catches the white foam of a falling wall of water. One internal thought cuts through the terrifying noise. The mountain is turning into a river. On the surface, the rescue teams from the Speleo Secours Air were already mobilizing. They stood at the entrance of the cave, listening to the sound of the water echoing up from the depths. It was a sound they had heard before, a low-frequency rumble that meant the cave was breathing water. They knew that at 700 meters down, there was no high ground. They could only wait for the storm to pass and the hydrostatic pressure to equalize. When the elite divers finally entered the system, 48 hours later, they found a landscape that had been scrubbed clean. The muddy silt was gone, replaced by a polished, bone-white limestone that looked like it had been sanded. The ropes were still there, hanging in the shafts, but they were shredded and tangled, caught in the jagged edges of the rock. The silence had returned to the burger, a heavy, dripping stillness that felt permanent. The investigation into the disaster would confirm that the cavers had done everything right. They were experienced, well-equipped, and had checked the forecasts. But the Vercors is a landscape of extremes, where a single thunderstorm can change the physics of the subterranean world in an instant. The water had moved through the limestone with a speed that left no room for human error or human escape. The Berger had simply reclaimed its territory. Nicola and Hamish were found deep in the system. Moved by the force of a flood that had reached a volume no person could survive, they remained together, a final testament to the trust that had defined their lives as cavers. The story of the Gouffre Berger in 1998 became a definitive case study in the power of hydrostatic pressure, a reminder that even the most expert explorer is only a guest in the basement of the world. The sound of the water in the Berger eventually fades, leaving only the echo of the roar in the minds of those who survived the rescue attempt. In the next case, the water is not falling through a cave, but churning through a Tibetan gorge so deep that the sun rarely touches the bottom. There, a different kind of world-class athlete was about to discover that some rivers are not meant to be conquered, no matter how much you have trained. October 1998. Deep inside the inner gorge of the Tsangpo in Tibet, Doug Gordon settles into the tight cockpit of his red kayak, the plastic hull groaning as it settles into the freezing, silt-heavy water of the Yarlung Tsangpo River. The canyon walls rise 5,000 feet on either side, vertical sheets of wet rock that seem to lean inward, narrowing the sky to a thin, jagged ribbon of gray. He adjusts his spray skirt, the neoprene snapping tight against the rim of the boat with a sharp, final click. Doug was 34 years old, a world-class athlete at the absolute height of his physical and mental power. He was not a daredevil or a seeker of cheap thrills. He was widely considered one of the most conservative and analytical paddlers in the sport. To Doug, a river was a series of equations to be solved, a complex system of fluid dynamics that could be decoded with enough patience and skill. He moved through the water with a quiet, scientific precision that made the most violent rapids look like a choreographed dance. His life was a collection of high-pressure environments, but he always carried himself with a calm, understated dignity. He was a chemist by trade, a man who understood the molecular structures of the world, and that same attention to detail translated to his kayaking. He spent hours inspecting his gear, checking every bolt on his helmet and every seam on his dry suit. He believed that if you respected the equipment and the environment would provide a path through the chaos. The red kayak was more than just a piece of sporting equipment. It was a specialized tool, a carbon fiber extension of his own body. He knew the exact weight and balance of the boat, the way it reacted to a fractional shift in his hips or a light stroke of the paddle. He had spent years refining his technique in the steep creeks of the Appalachian Mountains, learning how to read the language of the water when it was forced through narrow, rocky gaps. In the months leading up to the Tibet expedition, Doug had been in peak condition, his body hardened by thousands of miles of paddling and a disciplined training regimen. He was a man of quiet habits, someone who found peace in the rhythmic repetition of a long morning run or the steady, focused work of a laboratory. He had a young family back home, a reality that acted as a permanent anchor, ensuring that he never took unnecessary risks for the sake of an audience. The National Geographic expedition to the Tsangpo Gorge was the culmination of his life's work. The gorge was a blank spot on the map, a place so remote and violent that it had been dubbed the Everest of rivers. For a paddler of Doug's caliber, the invitation to join the team was a recognition of his status as one of the elite. He understood the gravity of the mission, knowing that they would be operating in a place where rescue was not just difficult, but entirely impossible. He packed his gear with a focus that bordered on the religious. Every item had a specific place and a specific purpose. He carried a small, waterproof camera, a notebook for recording river data, and a few personal mementos that kept him connected to the world beyond the canyon walls. He was a man who valued order and clarity, traits that were essential when navigating a landscape that was defined by raw, unchecked power and a complete lack of human history. The team consisted of the best kayakers in the world, men who had spent their lives seeking out the most challenging whitewater on the planet. They shared a common language of technical terms and silent nods, a brotherhood built on the shared experience of surviving things that should have been unsurvivable. Doug was the elder statesman of the group, the one they looked to for a steadying influence when the pressure of the environment began to feel like a physical weight. The journey into the inner gorge was a slow, grueling process of portaging and scouting. They moved through ancient forests and over jagged scree fields, their bodies aching from the constant strain of carrying 80-pound kayaks through high-altitude terrain. The air was thin and cold, smelling of wet moss and the sharp, mineral scent of crushed stone. They were thousands of miles from the nearest road, a fact that sat in the back of their minds like a low, persistent Tibetan Sherpas accompanied the team for the land-based portions of the trip, their faces etched with a deep, ancestral respect for the river they called the goddess of the peaks. They watched the Westerners with a mixture of curiosity and a quiet, nagging concern. To the Sherpas, the river was not something to be conquered or paddled. It was a living entity that demanded offerings and distance. They warned the team that the inner gorge was a place where the spirits of the water did not welcome visitors. Doug listened to these warnings with a polite, academic interest, but his focus remained on the water. He watched the river with a chemist's eye, noting the way the silt changed color and the way the bubbles moved in the eddies. He was looking for patterns, for the underlying logic of the Tsangpo. He believed that even the most violent river followed the laws of physics, and as long as he understood those laws, he could find his way through the white hole of the gorge. As they moved deeper into the canyon, the sound of the river changed. It was no longer a splash or a roar. It was a vibration that they could feel in the soles of their feet and the bones of their legs. It was a low-frequency rumble that sounded like 1,000 heavy drums beating in perfect, terrifying unison. The water was a milky, opaque white, thick with the powdered rock of the Himalayas, moving with a volume and a speed that defied the team's previous experiences. The scale of the Tsangpo was impossible to capture in photographs or words. The canyon walls were so high that they created their own weather, with clouds forming and dissipating thousands of feet above the riverbed. The light only reached the bottom of the gorge for a few hours each day, leaving the kayakers in a state of permanent, chilly shadow. They felt small, insignificant, and entirely at the mercy of a landscape that had been carving itself for millions of years. Doug spent his evenings in the tent, reviewing the day's footage and making notes in his journal. He was meticulous about documenting the rapids, recording the flow rates and the specific hazards they had encountered. He was building a map of a place that had never been mapped, a record of a world that existed only in the roaring heart of the Tibet wilderness. He was a man who found comfort in the act of recording, a way of imposing a human narrative on an indifferent world. On the morning of October 16th, the team reached a section of the river known as the Upper Falls. It was a place where the entire volume of the Tsangpo was forced through a narrow, vertical crack in the mountain, creating a series of massive, recirculating whirlpools and drops that were previously considered unrunnable. The air was filled with a fine, cold mist that coated everything in a layer of moisture, making the rocks as slick as ice and the visibility poor. The team stood on a high ledge, looking down at the white water. The river didn't look like liquid, it looked like a solid, heaving mass of energy. The roar was so absolute that they had to use hand signals to communicate, their voices swallowed by the percussive sound of the water hitting the canyon floor. Doug studied the rapid for a long time, his eyes following the lines of the current, looking for the tiny, hidden path that would allow a kayak to pass through without being crushed. He noticed a specific hydraulic at the base of the first drop, a white hole where the water was being sucked back into a deep, subsurface vortex. It was a trap, a place where the buoyancy of a kayak would be neutralized by the aerated, foam-heavy water. To miss that hole, a paddler would need to carry a perfect line and maintain a precise amount of speed. There was no room for error. If you missed the line by 6 inches, the river would take you. The team debated whether to paddle the section or portage around it. The portage would be a grueling, 2-day climb over vertical cliffs, a process that would exhaust them and deplete their dwindling supplies. Paddling the upper falls would take only a few minutes, but it was a decision that could not be undone. Doug looked at the river, then at his teammates. He felt the weight of the expedition. the pressure of the National Geographic film crew, and his own internal drive to solve the equation. He decided he would go first. He believed he had found the line, a narrow tongue of green water that bypassed the center of the white hole. He climbed into his red kayak and adjusted his gear one last time. He looked up at the thin ribbon of gray sky. Then, back at the water, he felt a deep, quiet sense of focus. The same focus he had in the laboratory when he was on the verge of a breakthrough. He signaled to his teammates that he was ready. The first off detail was the vibration. As Doug moved into the main current, he felt a resonance in the hull of his boat that was different from anything he had ever felt. It wasn't just the water hitting the plastic. It was a rhythmic, heavy pulsing that seemed to match the beat of the river's heart. The water felt dense, almost like wet concrete, pulling at his paddle with a force that required every ounce of his strength to counter. He hit the first drop perfectly, his boat slicing through the foam and emerging on the other side with plenty of speed. He was on the line. He could see the green tongue of water ahead, the narrow path that led away from the white hole. But as he approached the second drop, the river surged, a massive pulse of water, triggered by a collapse of a snow bridge miles upstream, hit the rapid at exactly the wrong moment, changing the hydraulics in a fraction of a second. The green tongue of water was gone, replaced by a wall of aerated, tumbling foam. Doug tried to adjust his line, his paddle moving with a frantic, desperate precision. But the river was too fast. The red kayak was caught in the edge of the recirculating whirlpool, the water pulling the stern down while the bow was pushed into the air. He was being sucked into the center of the white hole, the very trap he had identified from the ledge. The situational pressure was a physical force, a weight that pressed against his chest and shoulders as the kayak was pulled under. He was in a vertical world of white and gray, the roar of the river now a deafening, internal sound that filled his skull. He tried to roll the boat, to use the lift of the water to right himself. But there was no buoyancy in the foam. He was being tumbled in a dark, lightless void where up and down had no meaning. You are trapped in the center of a recirculating vortex, 500 miles from the nearest road and 70 feet below the surface of the river. The physical setting is a cold, churning tomb of aerated water where the pressure is a crushing weight against your lungs, making it impossible to take a breath. The sound is a low-frequency rumble that you feel in your teeth, a vibration that tells you the river is literally pulverizing everything inside the hole. One internal thought flashes through the darkness: I missed the line. His teammates watched from the ledge, their faces pale as they saw the red kayak resurface once, nearly 100 yards downstream. It was upside down, the hull battered and scarred by the rocks. They saw Doug's head appear for a split second, a small dark dot in the white waste, before he was pulled back under by a secondary hydraulic. Then, the river was empty. There was only the roar, the mist, and the vertical walls of the canyon. The team waited for hours, their eyes fixed on the water downstream, hoping to see a flash of red or the bright fabric of a dry suit. But the Tsangpo gave nothing back. The river continued its relentless, crushing movement, an indifferent machine of silt and gravity. They realized that in the inner gorge, there is no such thing as a rescue. Once the river takes its prize, the only thing left to do is move on, or stay and die with the fallen. The investigation into the loss of Doug Gordon would eventually conclude that it was an unavoidable accident, a combination of extreme hydraulics and an unpredictable surge in water volume. The National Geographic footage of his final run would become a haunting document of the risks inherent in the pursuit of the unknown. But for the elite kayaking community, the loss was more than just a statistic. It was the end of an era. The moment they realized that even the most conservative and scientific paddler could be erased by the world. The Sherpas on the expedition looked at the empty river and whispered prayers to the goddess of the peaks. They believed that the river had chosen its tribute, taking the man who had looked most closely into its heart. They moved the rest of the team out of the gorge with a quiet, somber efficiency, their movements a stark contrast to the loud, confident energy they had possessed when they first arrived in Tibet. Doug Gordon's body was never recovered. He remains in the Tsangpo, a permanent part of the most violent river on Earth. His red kayak likely ground into dust by the same rocks that shaped the canyon. He is a ghost in the white hole, a silent reminder that there are places in the world where the equations of physics and the training of a lifetime are not enough to guarantee a way back. The river continues its roar, a sound that echoes through the empty spaces of the gorge. The quiet aftertaste of the Tsangpo is one of absolute, humbling scale. It is the realization that human skill has a ceiling, and that the natural world possesses a power that is entirely outside our control. Doug Gordon didn't fail because of a lack of preparation or a mistaken judgment. He was simply present when the mountain decided to shift. He leaves behind a legacy of precision and a warning that some rivers are better left unmapped. Sometimes, the water is a roaring giant in a Tibetan gorge. Other times, it is a silent, invisible killer in the Australian outback, a place where the sun is the predator and the landscape is a maze of red sand and tall grass. In the next case, the victims weren't world-class athletes seeking a challenge, but a couple on their honeymoon who took one wrong turn and discovered that the desert doesn't need a river to swallow you whole. High noon, July 6th, 1998. At the base of Uluru, Kazumi Hagui stands on the red soil of the Australian outback, shielding her eyes from a sun that feels like a physical weight against her forehead. Beside her, Hideo adjusts the settings on his camera, the plastic dial clicking with a sound that is instantly swallowed by the vast, ringing silence of the Northern Territory. Kazumi and Hideo were 38 and 35, a couple from Japan who had recently begun their lives together. They were on their honeymoon, a journey of discovery that had led them from the crowded, neon-lit streets of Tokyo to the ancient, rusted geography of the Red Center. They were ordinary people, respectful of rules and careful with their plans, carrying the quiet joy of a new marriage into the wild. In Tokyo, their lives had been a series of predictable, urban rhythms. Kazumi worked a steady office job where the air was always filtered and the light was always fluorescent. She was a woman of soft edges and a disciplined mind, someone who found comfort in the organized chaos of the city. To her, the outback was a mythic space, a destination she had seen only in the glossy pages of travel brochures. Hideo was the architect of their adventures, a man who possessed a deep and abiding passion for photography. He spent his weekends scouting locations in the Japanese countryside, looking for the exact moment when the light would transform a landscape into something transcendent. He was methodical and patient, qualities that had served him well in his career and his role as a husband. He wanted this trip to be their masterpiece. They had spent months preparing for the journey, researching the history of the Anangu people and the geological secrets of the monolith. They bought new hiking boots and light, breathable clothing, packing their suitcases with the focused energy of people who believed that preparation was the key to safety. They were not explorers or survivalists. They were tourists who wanted to witness the heart of a continent. They arrived in the park in a white rental car, the interior still smelling of the previous traveler's sunscreen and the faint, chemical scent of industrial air conditioning. Hideo kept the keys in his pocket, a small weight that represented their mobility and their link back to the comfort of their hotel in Ulara. He was a man who valued order, checking the fuel gauge and the map with a regular, quiet diligence. Kazumi wore a light summer dress and walking shoes, her outfit a testament to her belief that this was a day for sightseeing, not a fight for survival. She carried a small bag with a bottle of water and a few snacks, the kind of preparation one makes for a stroll through a city garden. To her, Uluru was a magnificent backdrop, a solid and unmoving landmark that provided a sense of orientation in an open world. The drive from their resort had been a study in scale. The road was a straight, black ribbon cutting through a landscape of red sand and low, scrubby trees that looked like they had been forged from iron. They had marveled at the way the monolith seemed to grow out of the horizon, changing from a small, dark hump into a towering, glowing wall of sandstone that dominated the sky. They spoke in low, gentle tones, their language, a soft melody against the harsh, percussive sound of the desert wind. They shared jokes about the relentless flies that buzzed around their faces and the way the red dust seemed to find its way into every crease of their clothing. They were happy, moved by the sheer scale of the landscape and the deep, spiritual resonance of the rock that stood before them. The park was busy that morning, filled with the sounds of tour buses and the polyglot chatter of visitors from every corner of the globe. The Hagwis blended into the crowd, a pair of polite tourists following the marked trails and reading the educational signs about the Mala people. They felt the heat, but it was a dry, manageable warmth at first, the kind of temperature that invites you to linger in the sun. They decided to take the base walk, a 10-kilometer loop that circles the foundation of the rock. It is a path designed for everyone, a flat and well-marked trail that stays within sight of the massive sandstone walls. They walked at a leisurely pace, stopping to look at ancient rock art in the Kanchu Gorge and the strange, wind-carved caves that look like the mouths of giant, sleeping beasts. Hideo was particularly focused on capturing the texture of the stone. He moved close to the rock, photographing the deep pits and ridges that told the story of millions of years of erosion. He liked the contrast between the rough, orange surface of the monolith and the pale green of the spinifex grass at its feet. He felt a sense of profound peace in the rhythmic repetition of framing and clicking. Kazumi followed him, her steps light on the red dirt. She watched the way the light played across the surface of the rock, creating shadows that looked like moving figures. She felt small in the shadow of the monolith, but it was a comfortable insignificance. She was part of a larger story, a witness to a landscape that had remained unchanged while empires rose and fell. The world felt solid and permanent. They had a small lunch in the shade of a ghost gum tree, the bark of the tree feeling like cool, dry paper against their backs. They shared a sandwich and drank from their water bottle, the liquid tasting faintly of plastic. They watched a thorny devil lizard move across the sand, its movements slow and prehistoric. These were the moments they had traveled thousands of miles to find, the quiet intersections of life and stone. After lunch, they continued their walk, the sun now reaching its zenith. The trail was less crowded now, the heat driving many of the other tourists back to the air-conditioned comfort of the visitor center. The Hagwis didn't mind the heat. They felt that they were experiencing the true essence of the outback. They were alone in the silence. The only sound, the crunch of their boots on the gravel. They reached a section of the rock where the walls were particularly steep and smooth. Hideo noticed a unique formation, a short distance from the path, a jagged outcrop that he believed would provide a dramatic foreground for a wide-angle shot of the summit. He pointed it out to Kazumi, and they shared a brief, smiling conversation about the effort required to reach it. It seemed like a harmless detour. The first off detail was a shimmering distortion in the air as they moved away from the marked trail. A mirage had formed on the horizon, a ghost of water and light that made the distant scrubland look like a cool, inviting lake. Hideo thought he saw a shortcut, a way to reach the outcrop without having to double back through the thickest part of the mulga grass. He took a few steps into the red sand. They stepped off the red dirt path and into the tall, dry grass. It was a deviation of only 30 feet, a few steps taken in pursuit of a better view. But as they moved deeper into the scrub, the ground began to ripple with a heat that made their eyes ache. They turned back to find the trail, but the grass was higher than they realized, and the red sand had already swallowed their footprints. The monolith, the only landmark in the entire region, suddenly vanished. In the flat, featureless plain of the scrubland, a person only has to move a short distance from the base of the rock for it to disappear behind the slight rises and the dense clusters of trees. The Hagwis were standing in a world that looked identical in every direction. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was a weight. You are standing in 45-degree heat, and the horizon is a flat, vibrating line of red and gray that offers no landmarks. The physical setting is a furnace of dry air where the only sound is the rhythmic, maddening buzz of 10,000 flies crowding your eyes and mouth. The heat is a physical blow, a weight that is pulling the moisture out of your skin and making your vision blur into white. The situational pressure is a cold, terrifying knot in your stomach as you realize that every direction looks exactly the same. Your tongue is thick, a dry piece of leather in a mouth that can no longer produce a swallow. You look at Hideo, whose face is a mask of heat stroke and confusion, and a single internal thought flickers through the white light of the sun. We were just right there. When the white rental car was found still sitting in the parking lot 3 days later, the authorities knew something was wrong. The keys were missing, and the interior was like an oven. The search involved Aboriginal trackers, the Anangu, who move across the sand with a deep, ancestral knowledge of the desert's language. They found the first signs of the Hagwis 10 kilometers away from the monolith. The trackers followed a trail of erratic, zigzagging prints that told the story of a desperate, disoriented struggle. The couple had moved in circles, driven by the visual distortions of the heat and the psychological pressure of the red labyrinth. They had finally stopped under a small, skeletal shrub that offered no real shade. They were found curled together, their bodies a final testament to a bond that held. The Australian sun is a predator that does not need teeth to kill. It works through the slow, relentless extraction of life, turning a simple afternoon walk into a biological collapse within 48 hours. The Hagwis had done nothing wrong but underestimate the lethal capacity of the ordinary. They were victims of a landscape that does not offer second chances to those who step off the path. The desert has a way of returning to its original state, the wind blowing the red sand over the places where people once stood. The white rental car was eventually driven away, and the park continued its daily rhythm. The only thing left behind was a pair of silver car keys, half buried in the dirt, catching the light of a sun that never stops watching for the next person to leave the trail. A pair of rental car keys sitting on a rock in the red sand. In Italy, it was not the heat that took the houses, but a mountain that turned into a river of black ash. The sound of shifting dirt in the desert is replaced by the rhythmic clinking of broken tiles as a town is buried in the middle of the night. Sometimes, the earth moves slowly, and other times, it moves all at once. May 5th, 1998, in the town of Sarno, Italy. Anna stepped onto her small stone balcony to bring in the laundry before the evening storm truly took hold. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of damp jasmine and the wet pavement of the narrow streets below. She looked up at the slopes of Mount Pizzo d'Alvano, where the clouds were draped like a heavy, gray curtain. Sarno was a place where history lived in the walls of the buildings. It was a town built in the long shadow of Vesuvius, where the soil was rich with ancient volcanic ash, and the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons and the church bells. Anna had lived here her entire life, moving through the same cobblestone alleys where her grandmother had once walked with a basket of lemons. Her apartment was a collection of small, meaningful objects, a ceramic set of espresso cups from her wedding, a heavy oak table that had survived 3 generations, and a framed photograph of the valley in the spring. She took pride in the polished surface of the wood and the way the sunlight would hit the copper pans in the kitchen during the late afternoon. It was a life of quiet, predictable beauty. In Sarno, the mountains were not viewed as a threat. They were the guardians of the valley. They provided the mineral-rich water for the gardens and a sense of permanence in an ever-changing world. Anna often watched the mountain as she sipped her morning coffee, noting the way the greenery changed color after a rain. To her, the peaks were as solid and unmoving as the foundation of the town's ancient cathedral. That Tuesday, the rain had been falling for days, a relentless and rhythmic drumming against the roof tiles. It wasn't the violent, thrashing rain of a summer storm, but a steady, soaking downpour that seemed to dissolve the edges of the world. Anna spent her afternoon in the kitchen, to the warmth of the stove, a comforting barrier against the dampness that was beginning to seep through the window frames. She was a woman who found comfort in the domestic, the sound of a boiling pot, the texture of flour on her hands, the familiar weight of a ceramic plate. She moved with a calm efficiency, her mind occupied by the small logistics of the week. She thought about the feast day coming up and the bread she would need to bake. The world outside the kitchen door felt distant and unimportant. Down the hill, at the Villa Malta hospital, the doctors and nurses were moving through their own routines. They were used to the sight of the mountain through the large windows of the wards. A constant, green presence that promised stability. The hospital was a fortress of modern medicine, built with thick concrete walls designed to protect the vulnerable. They felt insulated from the weather. By late afternoon, the town was a study in gray. The Vespas had stopped their buzzing, and the cafes were empty of their usual patrons. The only sound was the water rushing through the stone gutters, a deep and liquid gargle that echoed in the narrow passages. Anna adjusted the kerosene lamp on the table, the flame casting a soft, orange glow over the photographs of her ancestors. She sat by the window for a moment, watching the water run down the glass. The mountain looked different in the fading light, softer, somehow, as if the soil were becoming a fluid. She noticed that the birds had gone silent, a detail that sat in the back of her mind like a small, cold stone. She told herself it was just the intensity of the storm, a natural reaction to the heavy, unceasing rain. The first off detail was a sound that didn't belong to the rain or the wind. It was a low, structural groan that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. It wasn't the sharp crack of thunder, but a slow and heavy grinding, like a giant shifting his weight on a bed of gravel. Anna felt a slight vibration in the floorboards of her kitchen, a rhythmic pulsing that moved through the soles of her feet. She stood up, her hand resting on the heavy oak table. She looked out toward the slopes, where the shadows were now a deep, ink black. The mountain didn't look like a solid object anymore. Under the weight of the saturated volcanic ash, the soil had reached its breaking point. It was no longer earth, it was becoming black milk, a liquid slurry of water and ancient debris that was beginning to lose its grip on the rock. The pressure began to rise with a terrifying speed. In the space of 5 minutes, the groaning turned into a roar that sounded like a freight train moving through the center of the town. The mountain wasn't just falling, it was liquefying. Over 150 separate landslides were merging into a single, massive river of mud that was moving at 60 kilometers per hour toward the lights of Sarno. The situation reached the point of no return when the mud hit the first row of houses at the edge of the valley. It didn't break them, it flowed through them. The liquid ash was so heavy it carried cars, trees, and entire buildings like they were toys in a bathtub. Anna heard the sound of her front door buckling, the wood splintering under a force that was heavier than water, but faster than a landslide. The black milk poured into her apartment, filling the rooms from the bottom up. It was a warm, viscous substance that smelled of wet minerals and sulfur. Anna was pushed toward the ceiling as the mud rose. The furniture she had spent a lifetime polishing now floating in a chaotic, dark whirlpool. The lights flickered and died, leaving her in a suffocating, liquid darkness that pressed against her chest. You are trapped in a small, triangular air pocket against the kitchen ceiling, your face only inches from the cold plaster. The physical setting is a lightless, a fluid tomb where the mud has filled every square inch of the room below you. The air is thick with the smell of wet earth, and the only sound is a rhythmic, high-pitched clink-clink of your ceramic cups hitting each other in the muck. The situational pressure is a heavy, rhythmic pulse in your ears as you feel the weight of the house settling into the slurry. The mud is pressing against your legs, a solid and unyielding force that is drawing the breath out of your lungs. You can hear the mountain still groaning outside, a sound that vibrates in your very teeth. One internal thought flashes through your mind: the mountain is inside the house. The disaster at Sarno would eventually be recorded as one of the most devastating environmental catastrophes in Italian history. 160 people were lost, many of them buried deep within the ruins of their own homes. The Villa Malta Hospital, which everyone thought was a fortress, was the first major structure to be hit, the mud filling the wards and turning the place of healing into a mass grave. For 3 days, the survivors lived in a prehistoric landscape of liquid ash and broken stone. The rescue teams used long poles to feel for the living, a process that was slow and agonizing. When they finally reached the ruins of the apartment buildings, they found rooms where the mud had risen to the very tops of the doors, preserving the domestic scenes in a layer of volcanic silt, a modern-day Pompeii. The town was eventually rebuilt, but the slopes of Mount Piso del Vano are now covered in concrete dams and sensors. The people of Sarno still look at the mountain, but the sense of guardianship is gone, replaced by a vigilant, enduring caution. They know now that the earth has a memory, and that sometimes the soil that sustains a town can turn into a river of black milk without a moment's notice. The clinking of broken ceramic cups in the mud. In the next case, the silence was even deeper. Set in the Arctic north of Sweden where the sun never sets. There, a man who knew every rock and stream would step behind a tree and leave behind a world where even the shadows have a way of disappearing into the light. It happened in 1998, in a place called Stora Sjöfallet. In July of 1998, deep within the Laponia World Heritage Site in northern Sweden, Stig Engelmark sat on a weather-worn mossy rock. He was surrounded by a landscape that looked like the surface of another planet, a vast expanse of gray boulders and stunted birch trees. He took a small metal tube of reindeer pâté from his pack, his hands moving with the steady confidence of a man who was entirely at home in the Arctic. Stig was in his 50s. A biologist and a mountain man who had spent the better part of 3 decades mapping the subarctic wilderness. He was a local legend in the province of Norrbotten, someone who knew the name of every lichen and the hidden rhythm of every glacial stream. To him, the wilderness was not a place of danger, but a complex biological machine that he had spent his life trying to understand. He was a man of solitude and science, possessing a quiet and unshakable competence. In his apartment in Jokkmokk, he kept journals filled with meticulous notes on the migration of birds and the growth rates of Arctic plants. He was not a tourist seeking a thrill. He was a scientist moving through his laboratory. He carried himself with a specific kind of economy, every step and every gesture designed to preserve energy. Stig's relationship with the mountains was one of deep, mutual respect. He understood that the Lapland wilderness did not offer second chances, but he also knew that it held a beauty that few people ever truly witnessed. He had survived brutal winters where the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero and the wind could strip the skin from your face. To him, a summer hike was a routine stroll. The Swedish Lapland is a place of infinite scale, a territory of nearly 10,000 square miles where the human presence is a minor footnote. In July, the sun never sets, creating a phenomenon known as the midnight sun. The world is bathed in a constant, unblinking light that removes the fear of the dark, but replaces it with a strange, psychological pressure. There is no biological clock here. Stig loved the light. He found that it allowed him to work for 18 hours at a time, his mind and body sustained by the energy of the Arctic summer. He would often go days without seeing another human being. His only companions, the reindeer and the golden eagles, circling the peaks. He was a creature of the open air, a man who felt more restricted by the 4 walls of a lab than by the empty space of the park. His gear was a reflection of his personality, functional, well-maintained, and perfectly adapted to the environment. He didn't follow trends, he used what worked. His backpack was an old, sturdy model, its canvas faded by years of exposure to the high-altitude sun. Inside, he carried his notebook, a high-quality fishing rod, and enough supplies to last him for a week. He was a man who planned for every contingency. He was a focal point for his community, the person people went to when they wanted to know the history of a specific valley or the best way to cross a treacherous scree field. Stig didn't boast about his knowledge. He shared it with a quiet, humble generosity. He believed that the more people understood the wilderness, the better they would protect it. He was a guardian of the ancient, jagged landscape. As he sat on that rock in July of 1998, the air was perfectly still, smelling of cold water and crushed juniper berries. The silence of the Arctic is not the absence of sound, but a heavy, ringing frequency that seems to press against the skull. Stig took a bite of his pâté, his eyes scanning the horizon for the movement of a herd. He felt a deep, profound sense of contentment in the world. He checked his watch, a simple and reliable piece of equipment. Time in the midnight sun is an abstract concept, but Stig followed a mental schedule that kept him grounded. He had several more survey points to visit before he would set up his camp for the night. He looked at the half-eaten tube of pâté, then at his backpack, which sat in what rescuers would later call a resting position on the moss. Stig had grown up in the north, his childhood defined by the seasonal migrations and the harsh, beautiful logic of the tundra. He learned to read the sky before he learned to read a map. He knew how to find water in a landscape that looked dry and how to find shelter where there were no trees. This knowledge was not academic, it was a part of his cellular makeup, a set of instincts inherited from generations. He often traveled with a small wooden cup called a kuksa, which he had carved himself from a birch burl. It was a smooth, tactile object that felt warm in his hand, even when the air was freezing. He had a specific ritual for drinking from it, a moment of pause where he would thank the mountain for the water. It was a small, private superstition that connected him to the ancient spirits of the land. The biology of the Stora Sjöfallet was his greatest passion. He was fascinated by the way life could persist in such an unforgiving environment. The way the tiny flowers of the mountain avens would turn their faces to follow the sun. He saw the resilience of the tundra as a metaphor for human endurance. He spent hours on his knees, examining the delicate architecture of a moss colony through a magnifying glass. In his notebooks, he recorded the subtle shifts in the landscape, the retreat of a glacier, the arrival of a new species of insect, the changing patterns of the wind. He was a witness to a world that was slowly disappearing, and he felt a profound responsibility to document it before it was gone. He believed that every entry was a piece of a larger puzzle, a way of making the infinite world a bit more legible. His physical health was excellent for a man in his 50s. He moved with a lithe, cat-like grace, his joints accustomed to the uneven terrain of the boulder fields. He didn't use trekking poles, preferring to feel the rock beneath his boots, a direct connection that allowed him to sense the stability of the ground. He was a man who trusted his body, a machine that had never failed him in 30 years. On that afternoon in 1998, the temperature was a mild 55 degrees. The mosquitoes were a constant, buzzing cloud, but Stig hardly noticed them. He was used to the irritations of the wilderness, viewing them as a small price to pay for the privilege of being alone in the heart of the north. He enjoyed the physical sensation of the sun on his face, a rare and precious warmth in Lapland. He finished the first half of his pâté and set the tube down on the rock next to his pack. He noticed a specific type of lichen growing on a nearby boulder, a rare species that he hadn't seen in this part of the park before. He reached for his notebook, his mind already formulating the entry. He stood up, leaving his pack and his half-eaten meal behind, intending to step only a few feet away. The transition from a routine survey to a total disappearance was likely instantaneous. One moment, Stig was a living, breathing part of the landscape, a man of science and experience. The next, he was gone. There was no sound of a struggle, no cry for help, and no witness. The unblinking sun continued its slow, amber journey across the sky, indifferent to the fact that one of its most loyal witnesses was missing. The first off detail was noticed by a group of Sami reindeer herders who were moving their animals through the valley a few days later. They found Stig's base camp on the edge of a boulder field. It was perfectly organized. His tent was pitched correctly, and his fishing rod was leaned against a rock. His backpack was sitting open, and the tube of reindeer pâté was lying right there on the mossy rock. The herders shouted for him, their voices echoing off the gray stone walls of the valley. But there was no reply. They waited for several hours, assuming Stig was just over the next ridge, perhaps tracking a specific plant. But as the unblinking sun continued its slow circle, the silence around the camp became suffocating. They looked for footprints in the soft lichen, but the ground was pristine and untouched. When the Swedish mountain rescue teams arrived, they launched one of the most intensive searches in the history of the North. They brought in helicopters with infrared sensors and dozens of elite trackers who could read the history of a landscape in a broken twig. They found Stig's notebook, which contained entries up to that morning. The handwriting was steady and professional. He had simply stopped mid-page. The searchers were baffled by the lack of evidence. Usually, when someone vanishes in the mountains, there is a trail, a dropped glove, a scuff mark on a rock, or a set of prints in the mud. But around Stig's pack, there was nothing. The search dogs were brought to the mossy rock where the pate had been found. They picked up his scent immediately. But as they moved away from the rock, something impossible happened. The dogs reached a point exactly 3 feet from the backpack and then sat down, their heads cocked in confusion. They had lost the scent as if it had been cut off with a knife. There were no tracks leading away and no signs of a fall into a hidden crevice. It was as if he had been lifted directly into the sky. The elite trackers combed the area for miles, but they found no trace of his movement. The psychological pressure of searching in the midnight sun began to wear on the rescuers. The lack of darkness made the vast, gray landscape feel like a cage made of light. They began to hear things, distant whistles, and the sound of rocks shifting that they couldn't explain. The Sami trackers warned that the Stora Sjöfallet was a place where the earth itself could swallow a man without leaving a single mark. They spoke of the open grave, the idea that the boulder fields of the north are not solid ground, but a labyrinth of deep, invisible pockets. These fields, known as Blockhav, are composed of massive rocks that have been shifted by glaciers for millennia. Beneath the surface layers, there are deep, vertical shafts and pockets, often covered by a thin layer of moss or a bridge of smaller, unstable stones. You are standing in the middle of a massive field of jagged, gray boulders that stretches for miles in every direction under a sun that never sets. The physical setting is a barren, high-altitude desert where the air is so thin and still that you can hear the blood rushing in your own ears. Every rock looks identical to the last, and the pale, amber light makes the shadows disappear, turning the world flat. The situational pressure is a cold, ringing vibration in your chest as you realize that you are the only thing moving in this infinite landscape. You look down at your feet and see a gap between two boulders, a dark, narrow crack that leads into a lightless void beneath the surface. You realize that in this sea of stone, a human body is nothing more than a small, temporary detail. One internal thought flashes through the absolute silence. I am the only thing moving. The search continued for weeks, with volunteers and professionals scouring every inch of the valley. They checked the nearby rivers and the deep, glacial lakes, but the water was clear and empty. They used drones and high-altitude photography, looking for any change in the color of the moss or the alignment of the rocks. But the Stora Sjöfallet remained silent, a vast and unmoving witness to its own secret. Stig's family and friends were left in a state of agonizing suspension. Without a body or a clear explanation, they were unable to move through the process of grief. They returned to the park year after year, looking for any clue that the retreating snow might reveal. They left small memorials on the rocks, but even these were eventually reclaimed by the wind and the relentless growth of the Arctic lichen. The theory that eventually emerged was one of geological betrayal. It is possible that Stig, the most experienced man in the mountains, simply stepped on a rock that looked solid but was actually the lid of a deep, natural vault. In a second, the ground would have opened and closed, sealing him in a stone chamber hundreds of feet below the surface. In such a place, even the best search dogs would be useless. Stora Sjöfallet did not need a predator to take Stig Engelmark. It only needed the laws of gravity and the sheer, overwhelming scale of its own geography. The Arctic summer, with its constant light, created a false sense of visibility that masked the true dangers of the terrain. The mountain man who had survived the most brutal winters was undone by a single, silent step in the middle of a sun-drenched afternoon. To this day, Stig Engelmark has never been found. His case remains one of the most haunting mysteries of the Swedish North. A story told to hikers as a warning that the wilderness does not care how much you know. His backpack and the tube of pate were eventually taken from the rock, leaving behind only the gray boulders and the unblinking sun. Stig didn't just disappear, he became a permanent part of the silence. The quiet aftertaste of the Sjofale is the realization that we are never truly in control of the spaces we inhabit. We build our maps and our theories, but the Earth remains a vast and unpredictable entity that can reclaim a life in a heartbeat. Stig Engelmark was a man of science who was finally consumed by a mystery that science could not solve. He remains a ghost in the light of the midnight sun. They say the wilderness is a place where we go to find ourselves, but sometimes the wilderness is a place that reminds us we are only guests, and that the Earth has a way of keeping what it finds. In the next case, the secret wasn't hidden in the rocks of a Swedish forest, but deep inside the blue heart of a volcano glacier, waiting 50 years for the sun to finally reveal the truth. August 2nd, 1947, high above the jagged, snow-dusted spine of the Andes. The air is a thin, freezing vacuum that smells of ozone and high-octane fuel. Inside the cabin of the Lancaster Stardust, the atmosphere is a strange mix of post-war optimism and the localized, mechanical heat of 4 Merlin engines. The vibrations are a constant, low-frequency hum that passengers feel in their teeth and the marrow of their bones, a reminder that they are being carried by a converted bomber. The man at the controls is Captain Reginald Cook, a 32-year-old veteran with a distinguished service order. He is a man who understands the sky not as a void, but as a map of pressures and currents. Cook is meticulous, a pilot who spent the war navigating the dark, flak-filled corridors over Europe. He carries himself with a quiet, British reserve, his movements fluid and precise as he adjusts the trim of the silver aircraft. To Reginald Cook, the Lancaster is more than just a machine. It is a familiar, breathing entity. He knows the specific resistance of the control yoke and the rhythmic chatter of the instruments. He spent years in the cockpits of these heavy lifters, learning how to listen to the pitch of the engines to detect the slightest mechanical hesitation. In the post-war world, he is part of a new breed of pioneer, carving out commercial routes across the most dangerous terrain on Earth. Cook sits in the cockpit with his co-pilot and his radio operator, their faces illuminated by the soft, amber glow of the dials. The smell of stale coffee and wool coats fills the small space, a domestic touch in a world of high-altitude geometry. They speak in the clipped, professional shorthand of men who have survived the worst the 20th century could offer. For them, a flight from Buenos Aires to Santiago is a routine assignment, a steady job in a world trying to heal. Behind the cockpit door, the passenger cabin of the Stardust is a study in transitional luxury. The walls are lined with leather and polished wood, trying to hide the skeletal, industrial frame of the bomber underneath. There are only 6 passengers on board, a small group of individuals whose lives are about to be frozen in time. They sit in deep, comfortable chairs, their feet resting on thick carpets that muffle the percussive roar of the engines outside the windows. Among the passengers is Paul Simpson, a king's messenger who carries a heavy leather pouch chained to his wrist. Inside the pouch are secret diplomatic documents intended for the British Embassy in Chile. Simpson is a man of secrets and schedules, his life defined by the safe transport of high-value information. He smokes a pipe, the scent of cherry tobacco drifting through the cabin, while he gazes out at the endless, white expanse of the clouds. A few rows back sits Peter Young, a diamond merchant who has spent the last decade building an empire of stone and light. He is a man who values clarity and precision, his suit perfectly tailored and his movements measured. In his briefcase, he carries a collection of uncut gems, a fortune in raw carbon that represents a lifetime of risk and negotiation. He looks at his watch, a gold piece that ticks with a rhythmic, mechanical certainty, and wonders about the market in Santiago. Then there is Marta Ringert, a woman returning home after years of displacement. She sits quietly, her hands folded in her lap, watching the way the sunlight hits the silver wing of the aircraft. For her, this flight is a bridge between a painful past and an uncertain future. She carries a small, battered suitcase filled with the only things she managed to save: photographs, a few pieces of jewelry, and the memory of a life that no longer exists on any map. The stewardess, Iris Evans, moves through the cabin with a tray of tea and sandwiches. She is one of the first of her kind, a woman whose job is to provide a sense of normalcy and grace in the middle of a gale. She smiles at the passengers, her uniform crisp and her hair neatly pinned. Despite the constant tilting and swaying of the plane, she likes the way the silver service clinks against the china, a sound of civilization high above the unpopulated peaks. Iris is a woman of quiet observation, noting the way the king's messenger never lets go of his bag or the way the diamond merchant constantly checks the time. She understands that every person in the cabin is carrying a weight that has nothing to do with their luggage. She sees the Lancaster not as a weapon, but as a vessel of hope, a silver bird that is bringing people back to the lives they were meant to lead. She feels a deep, quiet pride in her role. The Lancaster Stardust is a silver needle sewing together the edges of the South American continent. It is part of the British South American Airways fleet, a company run by the legendary Air Vice Marshal Don Bennett. The airline is known for its aggressive schedules and its use of former military pilots who aren't afraid of a little weather. To the crew and the passengers, the Stardust represents the cutting edge of modern travel, a promise that the world is getting smaller and safer. As the plane moves toward the Andes, the cabin temperature begins to drop. The passengers pull their wool blankets tighter around their shoulders, the fabric feeling heavy and coarse. They can hear the wind whistling through the small gaps in the airframe, a high-pitched, lonely sound that underscores the isolation of their position. The sun is beginning to set, casting long, purple shadows across the white clouds that stretch like a frozen ocean toward the horizon. The flight, designated as CS-59, has been smooth for the first several hours. The crew has maintained a steady altitude of 24,000 feet, breathing through oxygen masks that hiss with a rhythmic, mechanical pulse. They have been in regular contact with the radio station in Santiago, sending back routine weather reports and position updates in the fast, percussive language of Morse code. Everything is proceeding according to the flight plan, a document of logic and intent. Reginald Cook looks out the windscreen at the towering peaks of the Andes. They look like jagged teeth rising out of the mist, ancient and indifferent to the silver machine moving above them. He feels a sense of profound respect for the landscape, a geographic pressure that he has learned to navigate with a mixture of caution and skill. He knows that the mountains create their own weather, their own rules, and their own endings. He adjusts the throttles, feeling the engines respond. The radio operator, Dennis Harmer, taps out another message. The sound of the key is a rhythmic da-dit-da, a steady heartbeat that connects the Stardust to the world below. He likes the clarity of the code, the way it strips communication down to its essential parts. He reports that they are 6 minutes away from their scheduled arrival in Santiago. They are beginning their descent, moving through a thick bank of clouds that has gathered over the volcano of Mount Tupungato. Inside the cabin, the passengers prepare for arrival. They buckle their seatbelts, the metal latches clicking into place with a sound that feels final. Paul Simpson checks the chain on his wrist. Peter Young closes his briefcase. Marta Ringert touches the locket around her neck. They look out the windows, expecting to see the lights of the city emerging through the gray mist. Instead, they see only a solid, unmoving wall of white that seems to press against the glass. The first small deviation is a matter of timing. According to the navigator's calculations, based on the speed and the wind reports they received in Buenos Aires, they should have cleared the highest peaks of the Andes minutes ago. But as Reginald Cook begins to throttle back for the long glide into the valley, the plane is hit by a sudden, violent turbulence. It is not a gentle shaking, but a series of heavy, structural blows that make the Lancaster groan in its very frame. What the crew of the Stardust doesn't know, and what no pilot in 1947 could know, is that they have flown directly into the jet stream. This is an invisible river of wind moving at over 100 miles per hour in the opposite direction. It is a high-altitude phenomenon that had not yet been formally identified or studied by meteorologists. To the instruments in the cockpit, it looks like they are moving at normal speed. But in reality, they are almost standing still. The wind is pushing against the silver nose of the Stardust with a force that is staggering. While Reginald Cook thinks he is miles west of the mountains and safely over the central valley of Chile, the plane is actually still hovering directly above the jagged peaks of the volcano. The jet stream is a ghost in the machinery, a silent factor that has turned their navigation into a lethal fiction. The crew is preparing for a landing in a city that is still 60 miles away. The radio operator in Santiago, a man named Astudillo, sits in a quiet room filled with the smell of warm vacuum tubes and electrical dust. He is waiting for the final confirmation from the Stardust. At exactly 1741, the speaker in his room crackles to life. The Morse code comes in fast and sharp, a rhythmic series of pulses that cut through the static of the storm. It is a single word, sent with a desperate, percussive clarity, S-T-E-N-D-E-C. Astudillo pauses, his pencil hovering over the logbook. He doesn't recognize the word. It isn't a standard aviation code, and it isn't a known English or Spanish term. He taps back a request for clarification. The Stardust responds immediately. The code even faster and more insistent than before, S-T-E-N-D-E-C. Then, after a short pause, the word is sent one final time, the pulses sounding like a frantic knocking on a wooden door. S-T-N-D-S. Then, the line goes dead. The silence that follows the final message is absolute. For 51 years, the Lancaster Stardust and its 11 passengers and crew simply cease to exist. They become a ghost story, a mystery of the high Andes that fuels decades of conspiracy theories. Some believe the plane was shot down by a foreign power to steal the King's Messenger's documents. Others suggest it was intercepted by something not of this earth. The word Stendek becomes a riddle that haunts the history of aviation. In August of 1998, two Argentine climbers named Alejo Moiso and Omar Cyrilnik were moving across the remote, blue ice glaciers of Mount Tupungato at 5,500 meters. The air was a freezing must, thin vacuum, and the only sound was the rhythmic clink-clink of their ice axes against the frozen surface. The glacier was retreating, its melting heart surrendering secrets that had been hidden in the dark for over half a century. Alejo stopped when he saw a glint of silver reflecting the Andean sun. It was a piece of twisted duralumin, a metal that didn't belong in the natural world of ice and granite. He moved closer, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps in the thin air. He saw a scrap of heavy wool fabric, then a fragment of a leather pouch. He realized he was standing on a debris field that was emerging from the ice like a slow-motion ghost, a wreck that had been ground into pieces by the glacier. The physical setting is a vertical, blue-black wall of ice on the side of a volcano, where the wind is a rhythmic, punishing force that tries to strip the warmth from your skin. You are standing in the middle of a 1947 crime scene that has been frozen in time, the smell of 80-year-old oil and wet leather rising from the melting surface. The pressure of the altitude is a sharp pain in your inner ear, and the silence of the mountain is a heavy, physical substance. You look down and see a perfectly preserved Rolls-Royce Merlin engine emerging from the wall of ice. Its metal surface is glinting as if it had been manufactured yesterday. The propeller is bent back, frozen in the exact shape of its final impact. You realize the mountain has been holding this entire aircraft in its grip, moving it slowly down the slope for 50 years inside a glacial mill. One internal thought flashes through your mind: they never knew where they were. The subsequent military expedition in 1999 and 2000 revealed the truth of the disaster. The Lancaster Stardust had not been sabotaged or intercepted. It had been a victim of the jet stream and a phenomenon called controlled flight into terrain. Because the crew thought they were over the valley, they began a descent that led them directly into the side of the volcano at 300 miles per hour. The impact was so massive that the plane triggered its own avalanche. The snow and ice had instantly buried the wreckage, sealing it away from the world. For 5 decades, the plane had been carried by the glacier, its pieces being slowly ground together until it reached a lower altitude where the ice began to melt. The forensic teams found the remains of the passengers, their personal items still tucked away in their pockets, a gold watch that had stopped at 1741, a locket, and the leather pouch of the king's messenger. The mystery of the flight was solved, but the mystery of the word Stendeck remains. Experts have proposed dozens of theories. It was an acronym for starting to en route night descent, or perhaps a garbled message for Stardust en route. Some think it was a symptom of hypoxia, the lack of oxygen making the radio operator's fingers move in nonsensical patterns. But because it was sent 3 times, clearly and sharply, the riddle persists. It is a final, cryptic cry from a silver bird. The story of the Stardust leaves a quiet, unsettling aftertaste, a reminder that the world is full of invisible rivers and words that have no translation. It is the residue of a time when the sky was still a frontier, and the mountains were keepers of secrets that lasted for generations. The silver engines of the Lancaster are now silent, sitting in a museum in Argentina, but the riddle of its final message still echoes in the thin air of Mount Tupungato. Stay safe tonight. Check your locks. On the other side of the world, in the high glaciers of the Italian Alps, the ice was preparing to give back a different kind of messenger. While the Stardust held the secrets of a post-war flight, the Presena Glacier was holding a man who had been standing guard for 80 years. Sometimes, the Earth doesn't just return a machine, it returns the person who was operating it, perfectly preserved, as if the war had never actually ended. Late afternoon, 1997. The high ridges of the Presena Glacier in the Italian Alps. A lone hiker named Stefano stops to adjust his sunglasses as the glare from the melting ice becomes a physical weight against his eyes. He is 3,000 meters above sea level, a place where the air is thin and tastes of ancient minerals. He reaches for his water bottle, his fingers brushing against the cold, condensation-slicked plastic. Stefano was a man of the mountains, a weekend wanderer who found peace in the vertical silence of the Trentino region. He was not looking for history, he was looking for a break from the noise of the valley. To him, the glacier was a static, frozen river, a beautiful but indifferent feature of the landscape. He didn't know that beneath his boots, the ice was beginning to breathe out the secrets of a forgotten century. To understand what Stefano was about to find, we have to travel back 80 years, to a world of wet wool and frozen iron. In 1917, a young man named Franz stood at this exact same elevation. But he was not a hiker. He was a soldier of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a mountain specialist stationed on the highest front lines of the Great War. For Franz, the glacier was not a scenic destination, it was a fortress, a prison, and a graveyard. Franz was 22 years old, with hands that were permanently stained by the heavy oil of his rifle and the gray soot of the wood stoves. He was a son of the lowlands, a boy who had grown up in the rolling hills of Styria, where the horizon was soft and the grass was always green. No, he lived in a world where the only colors were the blinding white of the snow and the deep, bruising blue of the glacial crevasses. His life was a series of rhythmic, freezing rituals. Every morning, he would wake in a wooden hut perched precariously on a rocky ledge, the wind howling through the gaps in the timber like a living thing. He would beat the ice from his boots with a heavy mallet, the sound a dull, percussive thud that echoed in the thin air. He spent his days hauling artillery shells up vertical cableways, his lungs burning with every agonizing step. The White War was a conflict of extremes, a battle fought not just against the Italian Alpini, but against the mountain itself. More men died from the White Death avalanches, triggered by the roar of cannons than from actual bullets. Franz lived in a constant state of sensory pressure, his ears always tuned to the low-frequency groan of the shifting snow and the sharp, cracking sound of the ice beneath the camp. He lived in the Ice City, a network of tunnels and barracks carved 12 kilometers deep into the guts of the glacier. Inside, the walls were a translucent, shimmering blue, and the silence was absolute. The air smelled of kerosene, damp fabric, and the sour, metallic scent of canned rations. It was a subterranean world where the sun never reached, and the only way to tell day from night was the rhythmic ticking of a pocket watch. Franz was a man of quiet duty, a soldier who performed his tasks with a mechanical, focused precision. He spent hours cleaning his gas mask, the rubber smelling of sulfur and old sweat. He wrote letters to his mother by the light of a single candle, his handwriting a disciplined script that didn't reveal the shaking of his fingers. He spoke to her about the beauty of the peaks, hiding the reality of the frostbite that was turning his toes black. He carried a small photograph of a girl back home, the edges worn smooth by the constant friction of his pocket. In the dark of the ice tunnels, he would trace the lines of her face with his thumb, a small, tactile link to a world that felt increasingly like a dream. He believed that if he maintained his gear and followed his orders, he might one day return to the green hills of Styria. He was a creature of hope, even in the cold. The uniforms of the Austro-Hungarian army were not built for the peaks. The wool was thick and heavy, but once it got wet, it stayed wet for weeks, becoming a freezing weight that pulled at the shoulders. Franz's puttees were wrapped tightly around his calves, a rhythmic binding that provided a small amount of support but did nothing to stop the creeping dampness of the slush. He was always cold, a deep, internal chill that felt permanent. He shared his space with men who had become as silent as the mountain itself. They moved through the trenches in a communal daze, their movements slow and deliberate to conserve oxygen. They didn't speak of the war, they spoke of bread, and the heat of a summer afternoon, and the way the wind sounded when it wasn't trying to kill them. They were a focal unit of the displaced, boys turned into ghosts by the altitude and the ice. Franz's primary job was observation. He would sit for hours in a small, rock-walled nest overlooking the valley, his eyes fixed on the Italian lines. He watched the way the light hit the peaks, noting every change in the color of the snow. He was an expert in the language of the mountains, understanding that a certain shade of gray meant a storm was coming, and a certain hollow sound meant the glacier was about to shift. He carried a heavy rifle, the wood of the stock scarred by the jagged edges of the granite. He rarely fired it at 3,000 meters. The enemy was often invisible, hidden behind ridges and inside their own ice tunnels. The war was a game of shadows and patience, a long, frozen stalemate where the mountain held all the cards. Franz felt like a spectator in a prehistoric drama, a small human detail in a landscape of infinite scale. One night, the wind stopped, and the silence that followed was terrifying. Franz stood on the edge of the glacier, looking up at a sky filled with a billion cold, unblinking stars. The air was so still he could hear the rhythmic pulse of his own blood in his ears. He felt the vast, indifferent weight of the universe pressing down on him, and for a moment, he understood that the mountain didn't care about empires or borders. He thought about the letters he hadn't sent and the words he hadn't said. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of longing for the smell of freshly cut hay and the sound of a moving stream that wasn't made of ice. He was a young man in the prime of his life, but he felt as ancient as the rocks around him. He leaned against the wall of the trench, his breath forming a white cloud that drifted slowly into the blackness of the crevasse. The routine of the war was broken only by the occasional, violent intervention of the elements. Franz had seen men disappear in a heartbeat, swallowed by a sudden crack in the ice or buried under a cascade of snow that moved with the speed of a train. He learned to walk with a light, tentative step, testing the ground before committing his full weight. He was a dancer on the edge of a frozen abyss, moving with a constant, quiet caution. His world was defined by the quality of the ice. There was the hard, blue ice that shattered like glass, the soft, granular snow that swallowed a man to his waist, and the hidden, treacherous layers that masked the deep chimneys of the glacier. Franz respected the ice, treating it with the same care he gave to his rifle. He knew that the glacier was a living thing, a slow-motion conveyor belt that moved everything toward the valley floor. By the summer of 1917, the pressure of the war had reached a fever pitch. The artillery fire was constant, a rhythmic thudding that shook the very foundations of the ice city. Franz spent his days repairing the tunnels, the sound of his pickaxe a sharp, metallic ring against the frozen walls. He was tired, a deep, systemic exhaustion that made every movement feel like he was swimming through thick, cold oil. He sat in the dark of his barracks, eating a piece of hard, gray bread that tasted of sawdust and salt. He watched the flickering flame of the stove, the only source of warmth in a world of blue ice. He thought about the Styrian hills, and the way the sun felt on his skin during the harvest. He was a sentinel of the Presena, a man who had been forgotten by the world below, standing guard over a kingdom of white. 1997 was an unusually warm summer in the Italian Alps. The sun was a relentless, golden eye that beat down on the peaks, causing the glaciers to retreat at a rate that alarmed the local scientists. The ice was melting, turning into 1,000 small, cold streams that ran down the slopes. Stefano the hiker continued his climb, unaware that the path he was taking was being revealed for the first time in 80 years. As Stefano reached a wide, flat shoulder of the mountain, he noticed a dark shape emerging from a wall of blue ice. At first, he thought it was a piece of discarded trash or a strangely shaped rock. But as he moved closer, the shape took on a familiar, disturbing symmetry. It was a human hand, still encased in a supple, dark leather glove, appearing to reach out from the ice as if seeking a grip on the modern world. Stefano stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs in a sudden, frantic rhythm. He stood in the absolute silence of the ridge, the only sound the dripping of the melting glacier. He felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The hand was not a skeleton, it was a mummified limb, the skin preserved by the cold into a substance that looked like dark parchment. The war was coming back. The first off detail was the uniform. As the sun continued to melt the surrounding ice, the rest of the figure began to emerge. Stefano saw the thick, gray wool of an Austro-Hungarian coat, the fabric still holding its shape after 80 years. He saw the puttees wrapped around the legs and the heavy, iron-shod boots that were still planted firmly on the ledge. The soldier was standing upright, a sentinel who had never left his post. The pressure in the air changed as Stefano realized he was looking at a man who had died in another century. The soldier's face was still encased in a thin layer of clear ice, a frozen mask that preserved his final expression. It was not a look of terror, but one of profound, weary resignation. He looked like he had simply sat down to rest and forgotten to wake up. The past was no longer a story, it was a physical presence. Stefano called the authorities, and within hours, the ridge was a hive of quiet, professional activity. The forensic archaeologists moved with a rhythmic, careful speed, using small heaters and brushes to gently thaw the soldier from his icy tomb. They treated him with a deep, unspoken reverence, understanding that they were not just recovering a body, but a witness to a dark period of human history that the mountain had finally decided to share. As the ice retreated, the soldier's personal effects were revealed. They found his rifle, the wood still smelling of linseed oil, his gas mask, the rubber still flexible, and a small, sodden notebook tucked into his breast pocket. They found the photograph of the girl, the image faded but still visible. A final, heartbreaking link to the world of Styria. The soldier was a time traveler, a messenger from a war that had never truly ended for him. The forensics of the Presena Glacier are a masterclass in natural preservation. The constant, sub-zero temperatures and the lack of oxygen inside the ice had prevented the normal process of decay. The soldier's skin, hair, and even the contents of his stomach were perfectly preserved. He was a biological time capsule, a man who had been mummified by the mountain while he was still standing in the trenches of 1917. You are standing on a narrow, icy ledge, 3,000 meters above the valley, and the air is a freezing, thin vacuum that makes your head spin. The physical setting is a wall of shimmering blue ice that is slowly surrendering a human body. The smell of 80-year-old wet wool and kerosene rising from the melting surface. The sound is the rhythmic crack-crack of a chisel as the past is chipped away from the present. The situational pressure is a heavy, cold weight in your chest as you look into the frozen eyes of a man who died before your grandfathers were born. The light of the 1997 sun is hitting his face for the first time in 8 decades, and you can see the individual fibers of his uniform and the texture of his skin. One internal thought flashes through the absolute silence of the peaks: he is still on duty. The soldier was eventually identified as one of the thousands of young men who vanished during the heavy fighting of 1917. He was taken down to the valley in a helicopter, a rhythmic thudding that echoed through the canyons as he left the mountain for the last time. He was buried in a small military cemetery with full honors. A final, peaceful ending to a journey that had been frozen for 80 years. The investigation into the Presena discovery revealed that the soldier had likely been killed by a sudden, localized avalanche or a fall into a hidden crevasse during a night patrol. The ice had swallowed him instantly, moving him slowly down the slope inside the glacial flow until the unusually warm summer of '97 finally brought him to the surface. He was the first of many frozen sentinels to emerge as the climate began to shift. The story of the soldier on the Presena leaves a quiet, heavy aftertaste that lingers like the cold air of a cellar. It is a reminder that the earth has a way of holding on to our history, and that the things we bury in the ice are never truly gone. The soldier didn't just disappear into the past, he waited for the world to be ready to see him again. He remains a symbol of the White War, a silent ghost in the high Alps. The soldier from the Presena Glacier was eventually laid to rest in a small cemetery in the valley of Peyo. It was a funeral 80 years in the making. There were no family members present because everyone who had known his name was already gone. The air during the ceremony was still and heavy, carrying the scent of damp pine and the cold, mineral breath of the peaks above. He was no longer a soldier. He was a fragment of a lost world returned to the soil. Since that summer in 1997, the mountain has not stopped giving back its dead. Every time the sun lingers a little too long on the ice, another dark shape begins to emerge. Sometimes it is just a leather glove, or a wooden crate of ammunition, or a letter that was never mailed. Each object comes out of the glacier looking perfectly new, as if the ice had stopped the clock the moment the soldier stepped into the crevasse. It is a slow-motion resurrection. In a small museum in the village below, you can stand behind a glass case and look at the things these men carried. You can see a piece of hard, gray bread that still shows the marks of a soldier's teeth. You can see a handwritten poem where the ink is still dark and sharp. These are the small, precise anchors of a life that was lived at the edge of the world. They feel more real than the history books because they are things a person touched and held. The silence in that museum is the same silence we have been moving through tonight. It is the weight of things that refuse to be forgotten, the residual energy of lives that were interrupted by a storm, a river, a killer, or a mountain. We have traveled from the murky industrial banks of the Vistula to the red, vibrating sands of Uluru. We have heard the roar of the Gouffre burger and felt the crushing pressure of the snow at Les Orres. Each story left a mark. As the final echoes of the soldier's story fade, the room around you might feel a little quieter than it did an hour ago. Maybe the rain against the glass has slowed to a rhythmic, steady dripping, or the shadows in the corner of your hallway seem to have settled into a deeper shade of gray. There is a specific kind of stillness that comes after looking into the dark for too long, a feeling that the walls are leaning in just a fraction of an inch to listen. We spend our lives building maps and systems to make the world feel predictable. We check the weather, we lock our doors, and we follow the marked trails, believing that if we respect the rules, the world will respect us back. But the stories from 1998 and '99 remind us that the rules are often written in a language we don't speak. The Earth has a memory that functions on a scale of centuries, and it does not always offer a warning before it shifts. Think about the things we have seen tonight. A silver Rolls-Royce engine glinting in the Andean sun after 50 years. A red kayak disappearing into a white hole in Tibet. A tube of reindeer pâté sitting on a mossy rock in the midnight sun. These objects are not just evidence. They are the last visible traces of people who believed they were safe. They are the survivors of the incidents. The small, inanimate witnesses that were left behind to tell the story of what happened. There is a comfort in the mundane details that surround us right now. The weight of the phone in your hand, the texture of the fabric on your chair, the rhythmic ticking of a clock in another room. These are the anchors that hold us in the present, preventing us from drifting too far into the shadows. We rely on them to tell us that we are still here, and that the world we know is still solid and reliable. But tonight, those objects might look a little different to you. You might find yourself looking at your own front door and wondering about the deadbolt. You might notice the way the light from your screen reflects in the window, creating a ghost of your own reflection that seems to watch you from the dark outside. These are not grand terrors, but small, precise observations that remind us of our own fragility. We are only guests in this landscape, moving through a world that was here long before us and will remain long after we are gone. The stories we tell at 2 a.m. are not meant to scare us with adjectives or loud noises. They are meant to remind us that the most frightening things are the ones that actually happened. The horror comes from the realization that the people in these stories were just like us. Ordinary, careful, and full of plans. They were caught in the gears of a world that didn't notice them. A world that took them and then, years later, decided to give them back. As you prepare to close this session and move towards sleep, I hope you find a quiet sort of peace in the stillness. There is a value in acknowledging the dark, in understanding the risks that exist just beyond the edge of the light. It makes the warmth of your own bed feel a little more precious, and the safety of your own home feel like a hard-won victory. The night is long, but it is also a space for reflection, a time to listen to the things the day usually drowns out. If these accounts of the lost and the found have stayed with you, perhaps you could let me know. A simple comment about which story felt the heaviest or where you are listening from is a way of bridging the gap between us in the silence. It is a reminder that even in the middle of the night, we are not entirely alone. If you found a bit of rest or a new perspective here, consider subscribing so we can look into the shadows together again when the sun goes down. I'm going to leave you now to the rhythm of your own breathing and the soft sounds of your house settling into the night. The rain is still falling, a gentle reminder that the world is still moving, still breathing, and still holding on to its secrets. Take a moment to check your surroundings, to ensure that the things you trust are where they should be. It is a small ritual, a simple act of control that provides a sense of order before the lights go out. Consider the silence of the Vistula River, or the deep, pressurized calm of the Gouffre Berger. Think of the wide, sun-drenched plains of the Australian outback in the blue, unmoving heart of the Presena Glacier. These places are still there, at this very second, holding their breath in the dark. They are the permanent features of our world. The silent stages where these dramas played out. We are only the audience, watching the light fade across the red sandstone. The residual energy of a story is like a scent that lingers in a room long after the person has left. It is a subtle pressure, a quiet vibration that you can feel in the air if you stay still enough. Tonight, that energy is one of resilience and return. The world eventually gives back what it takes. Even if it takes 80 years and a melting glacier to do it, the truth always finds a way to reach the surface, moving through the silt and the ice at its own rhythmic pace. Look at the small objects on your nightstand. A glass of water, a book, a set of keys. In 40 or 50 years, what story would they tell if they were found in a place where they didn't belong? It is a strange, unsettling thought, a way of looking at our own lives through the lens of a future archaeologist. We are building our own collections of artifacts every day, leaving behind a trail of small, precise details that define who we were and what we valued in the light. The room is very still now. The radiator has stopped its humming, and the distant sound of traffic has faded into a low, indistinct murmure. You can hear the house cooling, the wood and the stone contracting in the night air. It is a sound of permanence, a rhythmic clicking that tells you the architecture is holding firm. Enjoy this moment of quiet. It is a rare thing in a world that is usually so loud and distracted. It is the silence that follows a long conversation. We have looked at 12 lives that were claimed by the environment or the darkness, and we have seen how those lives continue to echo in the present. From the student in Krakow to the soldier in the Alps, they are all connected by the fact that they remained. They were the ones who stayed behind while the rest of the world moved on. They are the sentinels of 1998, the people who remind us that every disappearance is just a story waiting for its ending. There is nothing left to say tonight except to offer a final, gentle warning. The world is a beautiful place, but it is also a landscape of traps and hidden pressures. Respect the marked trails, listen to the wind when it changes, and never assume that the ground beneath your feet is as solid as it looks. The earth has a way of shifting when you least expect it. A slow and heavy movement that can turn a routine afternoon into a historical mystery in a single step. I will let the sound of the rain carry you the rest of the way towards sleep. It is a natural white noise, a steady and indifferent rhythm that has been falling on this planet for billions of years. It has washed the ash from the streets of Sarno and filled the cracks in the glaciers of the Andes. It is the ultimate witness, the substance that connects every story we have told tonight. Let it soothe you, and let it remind you that some things are meant to be a mystery. Sleep well, and take care of the people around you. The bonds we form are the only things that truly protect us from the cold and the dark. They are the human chains in the oil-slicked water, the only resistance we have against the pulling of the tide. Treasure the quiet moments and the small, mundane details of your day. They are the life you are living, and they are precious. I will be here again when the shadows grow long. For now, just listen to the silence. One final check. The locks on your doors, the windows in your kitchen, the space beneath your bed. They are all exactly as they should be. The world outside is far away, and for tonight, you are safe in the light. The stories are over, and the people have all returned to the earth or the history books. There is only you, the room, and the steady, rhythmic dripping of the rain. It is a good time to close your eyes. The night will take care of the rest of the secrets. Thank you for spending this time with me. It is a privilege to share these shadows with you, to move through the dark together and find the small, precise truths that remain. If you have a moment before you drift off, a simple like or a quiet comment is all the connection I need to know you are here. It is the digital equivalent of a nod in the dark, a way of acknowledging that we both heard the same roar and felt the same pressure. Until next time, stay safe. The light on your screen is the only thing burning now. When you turn it off, the room will be completely dark, and the silence will be absolute. Don't be afraid of the quiet. It is just the world resting, a pause in the long, percussive history of the earth. The mountains are still there, the rivers are still flowing, and the glaciers are still moving. But for tonight, they are all at peace. You can be at peace too. The journey is finished, and the day is a long way off. Check your locks tonight, not because of a ghost or a monster, but because it is a small, precise action that tells your mind it is time to rest. It is a way of sealing the perimeter, of ensuring that the world outside stays outside. The rain will continue to fall, and the shadows will continue to settle, but you will be in the light. Sleep now, and listen to the stillness. The 12 stories of 1998 are finally silent. Good night. Think of the girl in Krakow who just wanted to reach the library. Think of the couple in Australia who just wanted a photo of a rock. Think of the soldier in the Alps who was just doing his duty. They were all part of a larger mechanism that they couldn't see, a clockwork of geography and timing that eventually claimed them. Their stories are not just tragedies. They are the evidence of our shared vulnerability and our shared desire to find a way back home. The world is a collection of residues. It is the oily sheen on the water in the Philippines, the smell of wood smoke in a shed in Ontario, and the glint of a silver wing in the Andes. These are the things that remain when the people are gone. The small, physical objects that hold the memory of what happened. They are the true narrators of history. The silent witnesses that wait for decades for someone to look at them and ask the right questions about the darkness. So, as the rain continues its steady, rhythmic pulse against your window, let yourself settle into the quiet. The stories have all been told, and the secrets have all been revealed. The air in your room is still, and the shadows are at rest. You are here, in the present, surrounded by the mundane and reliable details of your own life. Enjoy the comfort of the light, and remember that the night is just a space for the things that need to be found. Stay safe.